Story 1.
The most important thing in hunting werewolves is understanding to which specific type they belong. Contrary to common belief, they are divided into many species, and based on this, one must choose the appropriate method of dealing with them. Take, for example, the type I detest the most, lycanthropes. This name comes from the lycanthropy virus, and no, it's not a mental illness where a person runs on all fours, constantly howling and thinking they're a wolf. It's a real virus transmitted through a bite. Yes, just one bite, and you're doomed, so one must be extremely careful with the infected. There is no cure for it, but if you think about it, humanity hasn't even invented a cure for tetanus, let alone lycanthropy. So why hasn't this virus spread across the earth, you may ask? The thing is, transformations only occur during the full moon, and the virus is transmitted in its transformed state. On other days, they are just regular people. Sometimes you might not even suspect that your husband is a lycanthrope and live with him peacefully. But then you notice that during the full moon, he constantly goes somewhere. On a business trip, fishing, and one day when he comes home without any fish, you begin to suspect infidelity. But that's not the case. No, he wasn't spending that time frolicking with a busty beauty in a hotel. All that time, he was in some shed deep in the woods, howling in pain and scaring tourists. So why does he hide? You may ask again. The reason is, that's where we come in. Discovering a lycanthrope, our duty is to destroy it, regardless of whether yesterday you were sitting together in a bar drinking beer. Yes, it's cruel, but otherwise it would mean the end of humanity. In history, there is even one case called the Lüneburg Massacre. It happened somewhere in Europe. It turned out that the whole town was infected, so the government had to send an army there, as the hunters themselves wouldn't cope. It was truly a bloody event, and I would never want to be involved in something like that. In addition to lycanthropes, there are also other types of werewolves, for example, mutants. They usually live in remote forests or mountains, also found in deserts and swamps, in places where humans rarely venture, and as usual, they are not as dangerous. No, of course, if you encounter one, you're unlikely to survive. But these creatures are smart enough to stay away from civilization. They cannot transform into humans. Essentially, they are animals, just of enormous size and taking strange forms. Unlike lycanthropes, whom you can kill by shooting them in the head, with these guys, it's not that simple. Some of them have super fast regeneration, so we've had to find other approaches to deal with them. Their origins are unknown. It's said that they are remnants of surviving monsters from prehistoric times. Another type of werewolves are shapeshifters. As you can tell from the name, these creatures can take on the appearance of any human. When they are in their true form, they look like wolves walking on their hind legs, though their figure slightly resembles that of a human. These guys are a real pain in the neck for our organization. There were even cases when they infiltrated our ranks. When this was discovered, there was a lot of noise. Shapeshifters are also divided into two types, intelligent and unintelligent. It's simple. Some creatures can have intelligence equal to or even better than humans. Those are hard to catch as they hide very skillfully. The second type acts purely on instincts, and it's not difficult to recognize them. Just ask them, "Hey Ethan, how's it going?" If you hear a growl in response, then you better grab your gun. There are also werewolves that appear due to ancient curses. I still haven't figured out how this works, but these creatures are truly powerful. In this case, the entire department is alerted, and hundreds of people rush to resolve this issue as soon as possible. And the last type is the so-called Dogmen. These creatures greatly resemble humans. Imagine a hairy man, multiply his hairiness by 100, plus make it cover his face and add a tail. And there you have a Dogman. I don't know about others, but for some reason, they evoke the greatest disgust in me. There's little aesthetics in them, or for some other reason, I don't know. They usually appear on the outskirts of cities or villages. Their aggressiveness depends on how the creature grew up. If it was constantly chased or treated cruelly, don't expect anything good from it. But there are cases when some old blind woman takes such a child, not knowing what she's raising. Then the creature, raised in love and affection, may not be aggressive, but still its intellect is like that of a dog. And the appearance is frightening. Where they come from is unknown. They appear unexpectedly, like mushrooms after rain. In general, when I first started my job, I began to wonder, where did werewolves come from? And why do these creatures take on the form of wolves? Yes, someone might say it's some cultural lair based on the wild nature. But I know the truth of their real existence. I started asking questions, but no one could answer them. Only one old hunter told me that in ancient times there was an alpha ancestor from whom all types originated. But these were just guesses and no concrete evidence has been found yet. Well, that's about it. If I missed someone, forgive me, I'll tell you next time. But who are you? You might ask while reading this blog. Let's assume my name is Mike. Whether it's my real name is a secret. Once, pondering my life, I suddenly had the thought to share events related to my work. Of course, if I started posting immediately, I would be quickly found out and then it would all be over. So they will be published after my death. Yes, if you're reading this, chances are 99% that I'm already dead. If you've grown attached to me, just pray for me. I'll appreciate it though, on the other hand. I won't know about it anymore. In short, from now on, expect posts from Old Man Mike. Although I understand that most people won't believe my stories, but if you compare the facts and dig around the internet, you'll understand that I'm telling the truth. Okay, let's begin. I've been working in a top-secret organization for about 5 years now, which is called FAPRO, which stands for Federal Agency of Paranormal Research and Oversight. As you can understand from the name, we deal with everything related to the supernatural world. Whether it's a doll attacking its owners, or a reanimated corpse of a grandmother who showed up for a family dinner the day after her funeral. We've encountered everything. Vampires, zombies, ghosts. The agency is kept secret to avoid disturbing the minds of ordinary citizens. Our work is very dangerous, but of course well paid. Survival here depends on the professionalism of the hunter, and there aren't many of those. Therefore, among the employees, there is a high mortality rate. I'm lucky with my partner, who is as tough as nails. He saved me many times. His name is Neil. If I were to describe him, imagine some big-time thug, at the sight of whom you'd immediately cross to the other side of the street. Got the picture? Well, that's Neil. You might get the impression that we hunt exclusively werewolves, since I started my story with them, but that's not the case. It's just that my first experience was related to these creatures. We were driving along an empty highway in the state of Alaska, heading to a small town forgotten by God. It was a small one. Only about 700 people lived there. This was my first assignment after 6 months of training, and I was noticeably nervous. Neil, who had been training me for the past 2 months and with whom I had already become friends, was calm. We were sent to investigate suspicious disappearances of people in this place. Reports of disappearances came from there every full moon, which hinted at the actions of a lycanthrope. As we drove, I studied all the information about these creatures on a special secret government website. It was a kind of bestiary that indicated weaknesses, habits, and descriptions of appearance. Neil, driving the car and occasionally glancing at me, was constantly grinning. Apparently, he was amused by the initial excitement of a completely inexperienced rookie. But never mind, at least I'll be ready for the encounter, and I continued reading, memorizing some paragraphs by heart. Soon the car stopped. I looked up and realized we had arrived at a roadside diner. Neil said it was the last place to eat and rest. Ahead of us was a long, deserted road. We got out of the car, and thick steam immediately billowed from our mouths. Neil shivered. He didn't like the cold. I raised my head and looked at the beautiful, starry sky. When you live in the city, you forget how magnificent the night can be. In the diner, we spent half an hour eating and resting, and I calmed down a bit. When we stepped out onto the street, Neil put his hand on my shoulder and said that it was an easy task, and I shouldn't worry too much. I understood that he had stopped here to dispel my negative and anxious thoughts a bit, and I was grateful to him for that. Getting into the car, we set off on our way, wondering what awaited us in that backwater. When we arrived at the designated location, it was already beginning to dawn. Before us stood a typical American town, of which there are many scattered throughout Alaska. The residents were not yet awake. Only occasionally solitary figures hurried about their business. We decided to look for a coffee shop, and it immediately appeared at the next intersection. Unfortunately, it was still closed. Neil stopped opposite, and we decided to take a little nap. 2 hours later, the landlady arrived, dressed in a huge fur coat of some animal. When she opened the door, we hurried after her. She turned around in surprise, examining us, but said nothing, then went to the kitchen. We took tables and waited. Soon we were brought menus. The landlady, having taken off her coat, seemed to have shrunk in size. She was a woman of about 50, slightly slim and quite pleasant-looking. She smiled and asked what we wanted to order. We placed our order and she went to the kitchen. When she brought the food, Neil showed himself from another side. He smiled politely and charmingly, which was new to me, as he looked like an ordinary huge thug. Then he turned to the landlady with a rather polite voice, asking if she had heard about the disappearances of people in this town. She was also surprised by such a form of address, but only shook her head, saying that there were rumors, but she didn't know who exactly had disappeared. Mostly it was strangers. The locals were all fine. Neil asked her a couple more questions and let her go. When the landlady left, I noticed that she cast a hostile glance at us. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Perhaps they don't like outsiders in this town. Anyway, the questions we asked her didn't give us the answers we needed, but Neil disagreed with me. "She gave us a clue? Didn't you notice?" he said. "No, she said she hadn't heard anything," I replied. "None of the locals were harmed. Those were her words, and they speak volumes," Neil said didactically, swallowing another bite of scrambled eggs. "Over time, you'll learn to pick out such grains of sense from sentences like a hungry rooster." These words indicate that there are several possible scenarios. Firstly, if there's a werewolf operating in the town, as we speculated because everything happens during the full moon, then someone is controlling it. After all, as far as you know, during transformation, these creatures go into a frenzy and kill or bite indiscriminately. Secondly, it might not be a werewolf, but some other malevolent creature that becomes active during the full moon. And thirdly, the entire town could be infected. At these words, I almost choked on the coffee that spilled a bit down my collar. The thought of the entire population being infected? With what? It was frightening. But Neil hurried to reassure me. "That's the least likely scenario, of course, so don't worry prematurely. Let's visit the local police station and find out more details." After breakfast, we paid and left. The hostess was no longer as friendly as she was at first, and this change in attitude slightly alarmed me. When we stepped outside, the town was already coming to life. People were driving around in cars, some pedestrians hurried somewhere, crunching their feet in the snow. Neil headed for the car, trying to start it up quickly and turn the heater on to maximum. The police station was located in the center of town. When we arrived there was no one around. We entered a small building and, walking down the corridor, found ourselves in the reception area. Behind the desk sat a chubby man in his 40s with a mustache. He looked at us in surprise, as if thinking, "What are these two people doing here?" Neil greeted him and handed over the documents. They stated that we were from the FBI, although that wasn't the case. It was our cover. We were supposedly from Department 23. On the other hand, if a real agent asked us for documents and saw the number of our department, he wouldn't have any questions. This department really existed and was created specifically to cover us, so we could be called FBI agents, although we didn't report to their superiors. The policeman, after reading the documents, shouted somewhere behind him, "Hey, Frank, 2 feds came and want something from you." My partner and I exchanged glances, smiling. Soon, a man with a beard in his 50s came out to us. This was the local sheriff. He greeted us and asked what we wanted. We questioned him about the disappearances of people in this town and other details. It turned out that mostly strangers disappeared, whom several locals had seen. However, it remained unknown with whom exactly these strangers interacted. I picked up a folder with dossiers which contained photographs of people of different ages, genders, and appearances. They had nothing in common. They came to the town and disappeared without a trace. Where and how it happened, no one knew, no witnesses were found. Usually they stayed at the hotel or just passed by. Since the town was somewhat secluded, a large number of people didn't come here. We investigated each case but found nothing to hold on to. Then I came across a folder stating that a 10-year-old girl had disappeared. She had a cute face and curly gray hair. She was the only local who disappeared. I showed this dossier to Neil, and he began to study it with interest. 2 policemen kept watching us with displeasure, which made me slightly uncomfortable. But my partner behaved like he was at home, casually shuffling papers and spreading them out on the table. When we finished, we thanked the 2 of them, to which they grumbled something in response. Then Neil asked them to take us to the house where the girl's parents lived. The sheriff himself volunteered to escort us. We went outside, got into the car, and followed him. It was already lunchtime, and the sun was gently warming, making the weather more pleasant. After driving through several streets, we entered a residential area where there were small, cozy houses. Finally, we stopped in front of one of them. The sheriff got out of the car and headed for the fenced yard, the fence of which was slightly lower than human height. Suddenly, a fierce dog jumped out from behind the fence, starting to jump and bark at us, as if it saw its sworn enemy. The sheriff rang the doorbell, which was located on the gate, and soon a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a warm sweater, came out. Seeing us, she came out, shouting at the dog and leading it into the enclosure. Then she approached us and asked what we wanted. The sheriff explained to her that we would like to know about the disappearance of her daughter. She sighed sadly, and opening the gate, led us into the house. When we entered, we found ourselves in a clean and cozy atmosphere. Family photos hung on the walls. There were 3 of them: father, mother, and daughter. They all smiled happily. We went into the kitchen where the hostess offered us tea. We agreed and sat down on a small couch. Then we explained that we had come to this town to investigate the disappearances of people, and we were interested in the case of her daughter's disappearance. She, sitting opposite us, began to tell that nothing suspicious had happened before the disappearance. And one day when she went to the store for groceries, she left her daughter alone. And when she returned, she was gone. Her name was Sarah, and her daughter's name was Emily. As she talked about her, she suddenly burst into tears. Then we asked if there was anything suspicious before that. After our question, she looked up at the sheriff standing behind us, then shook her head negatively. After that, Neil got up and took the sheriff aside. He seemed visibly annoyed, but the intimidating look from my partner cooled him down a bit, after which he went outside. "Well, now no one will bother us," Neil said with these words as he sat back down and addressed Sarah. "Now tell us exactly what happened. Don't be afraid, you're not in danger, I promise." The landlady nervously clasped her hands as if deliberating whether to tell us or not. Then she leaned in and began to whisper quietly. "Before the disappearance, my daughter talked about befriending someone. She constantly drew him on paper how they played together and had fun. He was some old man with a long beard. At first, I didn't understand who it was. But then I thought it might just be an imaginary friend. You see, there are few children around here, so she didn't have any friends. And I thought she was compensating for it this way. Plus, her grandfather recently passed away, and maybe she was drawing him. I didn't pay much attention to these things until one day I found my scared daughter, crying. When I asked her what happened, I learned that this friend was actually bad and promised to take her away. Her words alarmed me, but I couldn't understand where this person could have come from if Emily was always at home. My husband and I were already planning to take her to see a doctor. But then she disappeared. The police started the search, but it soon ended. And they threatened me not to tell anyone about her imaginary friend. Finishing her story, she burst into tears again. We tried to comfort her, after which we asked a couple more clarifying questions and then went outside, thanking the landlady. It was a strange story. But is it possible that behind the disappearances of people is a real maniac? A real person who has nothing to do with the supernatural? When I suggested this, Neil shook his head negatively, saying that we have a colleague in our agency who is called the Seer. He senses places where unusual things happen, and he predicted that this case is connected with something mystical. That's why the agency sent us here. Outside, we were met by the displeased sheriff who stood by his pickup truck and looked so unfriendly, especially at Neil. Neil approached him with a threatening gait and stood so close to him that the cop pressed his back against the pickup, saying, "Hey, what's going on? What are you doing?" Neil, on the other hand, loomed over the old man, staring him down. Hell, if such a giant approached me like that, I'd be intimidated too. Neil asked him why he decided to hide the fact about the imaginary person. The sheriff muttered something but couldn't give a coherent answer. No matter how much my partner threatened him, he remained silent, as if his mouth were filled with water. Understanding that we wouldn't get anything out of him, Neil let him go and we headed to the car. When we were leaving, the sheriff kept giving us a hostile look until we disappeared around the corner. Neil kept swearing, saying that guy was hiding something. But soon it will get dark and there will be a full moon in the sky, so whatever creature or whoever it was will show itself. We stopped at a diner and decided to split up to individually search for anything suspicious. Neil warned me to be careful and to immediately get in touch if anything happened, then he walked down the street. I scratched my head, thinking about where to go, and decided to head north towards the city center. As I walked, I noticed that people kept turning around and looking at me, and their looks, for some reason, were hostile. I couldn't understand why this was happening. It seemed like they were about to attack me any moment. It was quite unnerving, so I decided to turn onto a less crowded street. It was an industrial workshop district. It seemed like these huge buildings and hangars were abandoned. Some of them were fenced off with a huge fence. As I walked along the sidewalk, I noticed a big hole in one section of this fence. I decided to peek inside to see what was there and squatted down. In front of me was a yard, littered with rusty parts of production machines, iron beams, and other junk. But in the middle of all this there were children's swings, and on them was a 6-year-old girl with gray hair. She was smiling brightly and humming something. I realized it was a nursery rhyme, so I listened closely, and here's what she was singing. 1, 2, the moon's in view. 3, 4, it's at your door. 5, 6, the city flips. 7, 8, it's getting late. 9, 10, it's time, my friend, to run and hide around the bend. 11, 12, don't just stand, or the bearded man will take your hand. Hurry, scurry, do not wait. Through the alley, over the gate, leap and skip. Quick, 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 before the moonlight grows too thick. Safe at last, we laugh and cheer, until the bearded man is near. Next time the moon begins to rise, remember this and be wise. It was eerie, but she was describing what was happening or would happen in this town. And who is that man with a beard? I roughly remembered this little song and decided to approach the girl. But when she saw me getting closer, she jumped off the swing and ran away. I chased after her, shouting, "Stop! I'm not dangerous, I'll help you!" She didn't listen and continued running towards the building. We ran past racks of metal sheets when suddenly a brick wall appeared in front of us. A dead end. I felt relieved, thinking I would catch her now. But she didn't stop and kept running. I tried to understand what she wanted to do, but suddenly she just walked through the wall as if it dissolved. I ran up to the wall and began to feel it. But it was just solid brick. Could it be a ghost? After looking around and finding nothing, I decided to search this place for any other clues. But after a couple of hours, I realized there was nothing here. So I decided to return to the diner, which had become our meeting place. When I arrived there, I found Neil sitting at a table, greedily devouring waffles with honey. He had quite the sweet tooth. I sat down next to him and ordered some food for myself. I asked him if he found anything, but he shook his head. Then I told him my story. He listened carefully and said that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed in this case. He didn't share the details of his conclusions, asking me to wait until it got dark. Then much would become clear. It was winter outside, so it was getting dark early. After eating, we started waiting, discussing various theories. Suddenly, the bell on the entrance door rang, and we turned around to see a young couple with a baby in their arms. Neil cursed, saying they were probably not locals. He approached them, talked to them about something, and then came back. Yes, these guys were newcomers, which added to our troubles. I looked at them. They sat at a table, playing with the child, unaware that they were in danger. Time passed, and it was gradually getting dark outside. I noticed that the diner's owner was nervous for some reason, biting her nails, pacing back and forth. It was suspicious behavior. Neil didn't pay her any attention, buried in his phone. Then he muttered that the connection was lost. So, I took out my cell phone and saw a cross instead of the signal bars on the display. Apparently, something was brewing. My partner gave me the keys and told me to grab some extra weapons. We already had pistols on our belts, but apparently that wasn't enough. I went out onto the street and took a long suitcase out of the trunk. There was a rifle inside, then I went back inside. As soon as I sat down, The lights flickered in the room and then went out. I looked out the window and saw that there was no light in the neighboring buildings either. At that moment, the young couple of parents were talking anxiously, not understanding what was happening. Meanwhile, Neil sat like a true cowboy, still digging into his phone. I heard a scrape behind me and turned my head. At the counter stood the diner's owner. She was looking at the floor and her body was shaking. Damn, I started to feel like I was figuring out what would happen next. It was at that moment that the full moon emerged from behind the clouds. Right after that, a crunch sounded from behind. And when I turned around again, I saw the woman trembling even harder. Strange glints appeared in her eyes. They shone with an unnatural red color, making my heart beat faster. The woman's body began to convulsively shake, and through the silence, the sounds of crunching and cracking emanated from her bending and elongating bones. Her skin on her hands and face became covered in thick, dark fur. Her hands turned into paws with sharp claws, and her face elongated, forming a wolf-like muzzle. Muffled groans mixed with roars emanated from her mouth, only increasing my excitement and fear. The transformation ended suddenly. Now before me stood not a human, but a monster from myths and legends. A werewolf. The animal looked at us with eyes sparkling with wild energy. There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by my rapid breathing and her deep, steady sighs. I glanced at the neighboring table, where the young couple sat. They stared in shock at the scene, not making a sound. Only the child was babbling something childishly, playing with a toy. Everyone sat in their places, unmoving. It seemed as if time had frozen. But suddenly, the creature took a step, and then I noticed a sharp movement to my left. A shot rang out and a hole appeared in the werewolf's head. The creature fell to the side and didn't move anymore. Neil held a pistol in his hand, from the barrel of which a light smoke escaped. The baby started crying, and the mother screamed in fear. I approached them and tried to explain that we were law enforcement officers and that they might be in danger. So they had to do what we said. Surprisingly, they all quickly understood and tried to calm the baby. After that, Neil went to the kitchen and called me after him. We found a staircase to the attic and went upstairs. Standing on the roof, I looked around. A terrible scene unfolded before me. The streets were filled with werewolves. Some of them fought among themselves, emitting menacing roars and sounds of blows. The fur on their backs bristled, and their eyes sparkled in the darkness. Other werewolves, moving on all fours, diligently sniffed the ground, looking for traces of prey. Their nostrils flared with each breath, and they periodically stopped, listening to the slightest sounds. Sometimes they raised their heads, directing their gaze at various sounds or movements, and then rushed into the darkness after the detected prey. At the intersection, two large creatures were locked in a fierce battle, their snarls and cries echoing throughout the neighborhood. Sharp fangs gleamed under the moonlight as they attempted to deliver decisive blows. Nearby, smaller werewolves flitted about, hoping for the outcome of the fight, perhaps anticipating scraps from the victor. One of the werewolves suddenly broke away from the ground and, spreading wide its front paws, dashed towards the dumpsters beside one of the buildings. It began methodically rummaging through them, tossing the contents onto the street in search of food. The iron containers rang loudly under its powerful strikes. All of this created an atmosphere of absolute chaos and horror. I felt like a witness to some apocalyptic scene where civilization had receded before primal instinct and wild cruelty. Damn, so the whole city was infected after all? Is this going to be a repeat of the Lundberg tragedy? Neil murmured quietly beside me. We need to find a way to get out of here before they sense us. But before leaving, he pulled out a phone. not the one he had been stuck to before. It was a satellite phone. He dialed a number and waited for an answer. Soon, a young female voice sounded on the other end, asking what had happened. Neil briefly explained the situation, after which he was asked to wait. This time I heard a deep male voice that ordered us to leave the city and that we had 2 hours to do so. After that, the city would be bombed. My partner acknowledged that he understood and hung up. "Wait, hold on," I said. "Does this mean all the residents of this city will die?" "Yes, that's right, Mike," Neil replied. "Understand that they're all infected, and if this infection spreads beyond the city limits, it's the end of the world. That's why we're here, to address and control such situations. Of course, it's a pity for all these people, but there's no helping them now." It was hard for me to come to terms with this, but I just nodded silently, and we descended downstairs. The couple continued to sit in their places, though they trembled with fear, glancing out the window where hundreds of werewolves roamed the streets. We needed to leave the city urgently. 2 hours really weren't much time. I cast one last glance at the werewolf's body lying in the diner and suddenly noticed that the wound in its head seemed to be healing. I pointed it out, and Neil sat down next to it, leaning over the body to examine it. "Well, what do you think about this?" I asked. "It's unclear for now. As far as I know, werewolves don't have this kind of regeneration, so it could be something else," Neil replied. "But it's too early to judge." "Can we cancel the call then?" "No, not yet." "Understood, until we're absolutely sure we can't take any risks." Neil began to inspect the premises, then went to the kitchen and soon returned, motioning for us to follow him. We went to the kitchen, where there was a fire door. Peering outside, I spotted a small alley. Fortunately, there was no one there. We cautiously stepped out, peering into the darkness and listening for every sound. The street seemed to be shrouded in gloomy calmness, but occasionally a distant roar could be heard. The sounds of fights and the growling of werewolves. Neil walked ahead, scanning every corner, while I and the young couple with the child followed him, trying not to make any unnecessary noise. As we crossed a large alley, the child suddenly burst into loud tears. His crying pierced the silence, attracting the attention of the creatures around. We heard the prowling of werewolves cease for a moment, and then they rushed towards us with loud roars. Neil reacted instantly. He drew his pistol and began shooting at the approaching shadows. I also pulled out my weapon and supported him, trying to shoot those who came too close. Then we ran. Adrenaline surged, and my hands shook from tension and cold. The young couple was pale, running with the child pressed against them, trying to calm him down, but the baby continued to cry, each of his screams making us feel even more vulnerable. I turned around. There were more and more creatures. It seemed like our end was near. Then, ahead, I noticed the familiar figure of the little girl. Looking around, I realized that we had stumbled into the same industrial district. The girl stood near the same fence, laughing and beckoning us to follow her. It could have been a trap, but Neil, without a hint of doubt, dove into the hole and we followed him. Before us was the same courtyard I had seen before, but the girl led us in a different direction. There was a huge brick hangar with massive iron gates. Luckily, they were open. We rushed inside and closed them behind us. There was a screech, and then we slid the lock handle, and then the sounds of bodies hitting the gates could be heard. The werewolves were trying to break through, but they couldn't. I tried to catch my breath. Although we had escaped, we were trapped. Soon the city would be bombed, and then it would be our end. While we racked our brains on what to do next, the figure of the girl appeared before us again, beckoning us somewhere. Neil and I exchanged glances, and silently nodding to each other, we followed her. Just before that, opening the suitcase and taking out the rifle, I handed it to the guy, telling them to stay here for now and shoot if necessary. It was clear they didn't want to part, but we didn't know what lay ahead. The girl stood by the hatch, signaling for us to descend. Neil pulled the handle of the lid and it opened, revealing thick darkness. I wondered where this girl was leading us, but something told me that if we followed her, we would find answers to many questions. It seemed my partner felt the same way, doing everything silently and without hesitation. We descended into a small room and found ourselves in a gruesome scene. As I took a step, I heard a crunch underfoot. Turning on the flashlight, to my horror, I discovered numerous bones scattered across the floor. They were human bones. Skulls lay here and there, remnants of clothing strewn about. Blood splattered on the walls. Was this a cannibal's lair? Carefully avoiding stepping on the human remains, we moved forward. The girl continued to lead us, beckoning us all the while. We entered a low and narrow corridor that twisted and turned until we reached a door. At this point, the girl stopped laughing and looked at us with pleading eyes before vanishing into thin air. It seemed danger awaited us beyond the door. We readied our weapons and quietly entered. We found ourselves in a large hall illuminated by torches. As I entered, I was hit by a choking odor of decay. Looking around, I realized the source of the stench. Human remains hung from chains on the walls. Some bodies were fresher, some almost dried up. In the center of the hall was a small structure consisting of 4 tall stone pillars, to which a glowing sphere was attached, hovering above and below the ground. Behind it stood a massive statue in the shape of a wolf's head. To the left of the altar stood a man next to a huge cauldron above which a fire burned. Steam rose from it as the man stirred something with a large ladle. He wore a red shirt and denim overalls with a winter hat on his head. Suddenly, he turned around, and I saw his face. Low forehead, close-set small and malicious eyes, large nose, and long beard. He reminded me of a lumberjack, except he lacked an axe. Glancing to my left, I indeed saw a massive axe lying on the table. Before the man could react, a shot rang out. I noticed that Neil didn't hesitate in such moments and didn't give the opponent a chance to react. Perhaps it was experience. A bullet pierced the man's head, and he fell to the side. We moved on, watching to see if he moved. He seemed motionless. So I approached the cauldron and peered inside. There floated human remains boiling in the broth. This time I couldn't hold back, and as I turned, I felt someone grab my leg. To my horror, I discovered that the man was still alive. I struggled, pulling out my gun and shooting him in the head with Neil joining in. Finally, I broke free, but the man also got up. It seemed the bullets meant nothing to him. He grabbed the axe and charged at us. We managed to dodge at the last moment, causing him to embed the axe into the floor. We continued to shoot, but to no avail. He ran at me again with the axe, swinging and trying to chop me. His eyes burned with fury, and saliva and incomprehensible growls escaped his mouth. It felt like I was fighting a beast. I dodged as best I could while continuing to shoot, causing part of his skull to simply fall off, but he, like a zombie, was relentless. Pressing the trigger, I realized that the magazine was empty. Damn. I wouldn't have time to reload. Eventually, the man cornered me and raised the axe, and I thought it was the end for me when another shot rang out. But this time, it came from the glowing sphere. The lumberjack noticed it and shouted furiously. The axe fell from his hands, and he staggered towards the altar. It split open like an egg and crumbled into pieces. To my surprise, the same girl emerged from it, now lying unconscious on the floor. Meanwhile, the man began to melt like a candle, emitting sounds of agony until only his clothes and skeleton remained. Neil approached me and helped me up. I looked at him questioningly. He sighed tiredly and replied, "One of the rules in dealing with such creatures, if bullets don't work, look for the vessel of their immortality. If there's no vessel and it's all innate regeneration, then look for a bigger gun." Fortunately, we found the first option here. Most likely some kind of curse is at work here. All right, let's check on the girl and get out to the surface. And that's exactly what we did. I approached and examined her. Luckily, she was alive. Lifting her up, we surveyed the room and, finding nothing else suspicious, headed towards the exit. But before leaving, I cast one last glance at the statue where a terrifying creature more resembling a monster than a wolf stared at me. It seemed to me that we would encounter something similar again. Emerging from the hatch, we saw our couple, who were fine. They held the sleeping baby in their arms, and when they noticed us, they breathed a sigh of relief. The guy approached us and explained that the noise outside had recently stopped. Neil nodded, indicating he understood, and approached the mother with the child, tickling the baby's ear and joking that this scoundrel almost buried us today. The baby grumbled discontentedly. Neil smiled and headed towards the gate. I stood a little behind, holding the girl in my arms. I asked him if he was sure everything would be okay. He nodded, unlocked the bolt, and then we stepped outside. Naked people lay everywhere. Some of them were coming to their senses while others remained unconscious. They awkwardly turned around, trying to understand what was happening. We began to wake them up, as it was freezing outside. After they regained consciousness and ran off, I suddenly remembered an important thing and glanced at my watch. Damn. There were only 5 minutes left until the bombing. I shouted to Neil about it, and he calmly took out his phone and dialed a number. He clearly wasn't in a hurry, while I stood nearby, nervously shifting from foot to foot. Finally, after a few rings, a female voice answered. Neil said into the receiver, "Patricia, please cancel the operation and send the cleaners to the city." She simply replied, "Understood," and hung up. I looked at my watch and realized there were 2 minutes left. Then I heard the sound of jet engines and looked up at the sky. Dozens of fighter jets streaked over the city like arrows, then disappeared beyond the horizon. It seemed like we had narrowly escaped. "So it was all a curse," I said to my partner. "Seems like it. Fortunately, we were all saved by that little girl who showed us the right path," Neil replied. "What about the residents? Why did they hide the fact that they were cursed?" "I don't even know. Perhaps they were afraid that if others found out they turned into monsters, they would be killed, or they had other considerations. We'll find out soon. I think the sheriff is involved somehow. He's connected to that guy in the basement. We'll deal with that too. We just need to wait for the cleaners to arrive, and then everything will become clear." I nodded, and we headed towards our car. I still held Emily in my arms, peacefully snoozing. We still had to return her to her parents. It was still night outside, though the full moon brightly illuminated our path. At this time, naked figures still roamed the city, but we paid no attention to them. The job was done, and that's what mattered.
Story 2.
We were driving on the highway in our new Cadillac, leaving behind densely populated areas. Taking our time, we traversed the wild expanses of our country, where open fields gave way to dense forests and small farms flashed by from time to time. I was behind the wheel, while my partner Neil, sitting next to me, was engrossed in a new hobby: origami. The scene looked quite amusing. A huge 2-meter-tall guy with big hands carefully folding sheets of paper, occasionally glancing at his phone screen, where a beginner origami lesson was playing. When I asked him why he was doing this, I got a simple answer: "I'm bored." A pretty valid reason. Neil was one of those people who always strives to learn something new. Perhaps that's why he joined FAPRO, the Federal Agency of Paranormal Research and Oversight. As the name suggests, our work is related to everything concerning the supernatural world. I recently completed my first mission, and I hope this time everything will go smoother. As we approached our destination, the landscape around us began to change. Fields of corn and neatly tended farms appeared along the road. Local residents driving tractors glanced curiously at our new Cadillac, adding to the atmosphere of our journey. After a few more miles, we entered a town which would probably be more accurately described as a village due to its size and tranquility. The streets here were practically empty, creating a sense that time had frozen. The main street was paved with cobblestones, and on both sides of it stood low buildings with shops, cafes, and a small library. The facades of the buildings were decorated in the style of the early 20th century, and each of them had its own unique sign, adding coziness and a special atmosphere to the place. It was the perfect place for a quiet life, or perhaps for a peaceful investigation where not only the secrets of the past could be hidden, but also some paranormal phenomena. When Neil finished folding a paper crane, we pulled up to the local law enforcement building. He carefully placed the figurine on the dashboard next to other origami pieces, then lazily stretched and got out of the car. I followed him, and we went inside. The building was small, with wooden panels on the walls. Fresh paint indicated recent repairs. Walking down the corridor, we stumbled upon a young officer who was fast asleep, his head resting on the table. Neil cleared his throat loudly, and the officer jerked awake, not understanding what was happening. Seeing us, he quickly regained his composure and apologized for his disheveled state. Footsteps sounded from the office, and following them, we were greeted by the local sheriff, a 40-something man with a determined and experienced look. His name was Jake Morrison. When we presented our FBI credentials, the sheriff and the young officer exchanged surprised glances. They clearly didn't expect to see federal agents in such a remote and peaceful place. Taking our documents, the sheriff studied them with interest and some caution, trying to understand what could have brought us here. After a brief pause, he invited us into his office. Stepping inside, we found a spacious room with dark wood furniture, adding seriousness and comfort to the interior. The sheriff gestured towards the chairs in front of his desk, and we sat down, preparing for the conversation. "Welcome to our humble town," he began with a slight smile. "It's not every day that FBI agents visit us. How can I help you?" "We would like to know if anything unusual has happened here," Neil asked. "Something unusual?" the sheriff repeated, widening his eyes. "How did you guess?" "Yes, indeed, there have been strange incidents here recently. Usually it's a very quiet place where serious crimes almost never happen. We mainly deal with resolving minor conflicts between residents. However, recently, livestock has started to disappear from the farmers. From the tracks, it can be judged that it's the work of wolves, which previously didn't appear in these parts, preferring to stay away in the forest. In addition, a local teenager disappeared, a 17-year-old young man with mental health issues. Usually he walked around the town peacefully, not causing any harm, and the locals kept an eye on him. His mother works at the library. We organized a search party, but unfortunately we couldn't find him. Probably he could have been taken by the wolves as well." "Was there anything else?" I asked. The sheriff didn't answer immediately. Scratching his chin, he reached for the phone and handed it to us. "You might find this interesting, but recently a meteorite fell into our forest. We even recorded a video." On the screen, it was night, but a small glowing streak could be seen in the sky, which at some point fell below the horizon. Neil stared at the image, his face showing a strong interest in this object. He asked how far it could have fallen. The sheriff pondered and speculated that it could possibly be a day's journey from here. Neil nodded and then asked him to take us to the victims of the wolf attack. We arrived at the scene in 10 minutes. It was a small farm fenced with neat wooden fences and located on the edge of the forest. An elderly man came out to meet us, whom the sheriff had called beforehand. His name was Frank. We questioned him about the incident. And here's what he told us. I woke up to the loud barking of the dogs. Taking a flashlight, I went downstairs and noticed that Jack, my dog, was highly agitated. I had never seen him like this. He alternated between fiercely barking, trying to break free from the chain, and whimpering, running into the kennel. I tried to calm him down, but he seemed to have gone mad and even bit me. Frank showed the place where he was bitten, which was already healing. So I cursed, and wrapping my hand with a towel, I went to see what was going on there. The noise was coming from the sheep pen. It sounded like there was a swarm of bees or something similar. It was a strange hum, interspersed with growling. The bleating of the sheep couldn't be heard. To be honest, I was a bit scared then. It was some irrational fear, as if on a subconscious level. But overcoming myself, I went further. The first thing I saw was the sheep, huddling in the corners of the pen and not moving. It seemed like they were dead. In the center of the pen, something was wriggling in the darkness. I was afraid to shine the light on that spot. My hand was trembling, and the bouncing beam of light finally reached its target. It was a pack of gray wolves. They greedily devoured the dead carcasses. Their muzzles were covered in blood, like everything around them. One of them, seemingly irritated by the flashlight shining on it, turned its head. I involuntarily took a step back, confronted with a terrifying, snarling face and red, glowing eyes. But that's not all. This creature seemed to mutter something. I don't know how to explain it, but there was a sound coming from it. After that, something rose from that pile of gray mass. Until now, no one believes me. But I saw it with my own eyes. I swear everything I said is true. So what stood up on its hind legs was a werewolf or a dogman. I'm not very good at distinguishing. But when it stood up on its hind legs, its height reached almost 10 feet. At first I didn't understand how it could hide among that pile with such dimensions. It looked at me as if I were prey, and I realized I had to run. But my legs wouldn't obey me. Paralyzed with fear, I was startled by Jack's barking. After that, I just turned around and ran into the house, then called the sheriff. Fortunately, those creatures didn't chase after me. When the sheriff arrived, they were already gone. It turned out that they had eaten half of the sheep, and the other half apparently died from fright. With that, he finished his story. It was evident that he was deeply affected by the incident and sincerely believed in the truth of his words. The story left an indelible impression on me. We thanked him for his honesty, then headed to the local library. On the way, the sheriff cautioned us not to put too much trust in the imagination of the locals, noting their tendency towards superstitions. My partner and I just smiled in response to his remark. Soon we arrived at the location. Apparently, the library served as one of the main leisure centers for the locals. Despite the compact size of the space, there was a lively atmosphere. People of all ages, from children to the elderly, were engaged in reading. Some sat at tables immersed in study materials. Some stood by the shelves, selecting literature or discussing the latest releases. The librarian assisted in book selection, moving between the shelves. However, it was evident that the past few days had been tough for her. The dark circles under her eyes and the tired look spoke volumes. It seemed she was trying to gather strength, fully immersed in her work, but it apparently didn't help much. The sheriff called her over to introduce us, and we, entering a separate room, questioned her about her son's disappearance. She recounted that in the morning, he went for a walk, as usual. First, he circled the local farms, then headed towards the town center. She strictly forbade him from going into the woods, but that morning he seemed to have gone there anyway. What exactly attracted him to the forest remained unknown. Searches for her son were unsuccessful. When the search mission was called off, she continued to search for him independently until she ran out of strength and lost consciousness in the woods. Fortunately, one of the local residents found her, otherwise she might have perished. It had been 2 weeks since her son disappeared, and the chances of finding him were slim. But she still believed he was alive. I felt sorry for her. We should try to find her son if possible. Apologizing for the inconvenience, we left the library. I asked Neil what we would do next. Taking out a cigarette and lighting it, Neil, in no hurry, said that we would go see where the meteorite fell. This puzzled me. Why was it necessary? And why was he interested in it? One of Neil's traits that irritated me was his vagueness. He liked to be cryptic and silent. Sometimes I had to really press him to squeeze information out of him. His teaching strategy sounded like learn everything by example. Fortunately, such tricks were not common for him. Then it means the oracle was right again. Something supernatural is happening here, I said. I don't remember him ever being wrong, even the opposite. If you didn't find anything, it means you didn't search well, Neil replied, exhaling a stream of smoke. If you don't remember, the oracle is a person working in our agency. I personally have never seen him, but there are many rumors about him. Soon the sheriff approached us and asked what we would do next. Neil asked him if there was a guide here who could lead us into the forest. The sheriff adjusted his hat and pondered, then replied that it would be best if he led us himself. He grew up here and knows the forest well. We thanked him and agreed to meet at the edge of the forest near Frank's farm. When we arrived at the location, the first thing we did was pull out spare hiking clothes. After changing, we looked like a special forces unit. Night vision goggles, special grenades to ward off werewolves, rifles, and pistols. We also didn't forget to bring other necessary items for the hike. Soon the sheriff arrived. He was dressed much simpler. His armament consisted of a shotgun, and on his head was a hat with an attached mosquito net, as well as a hiking bag. Seeing our equipment, he couldn't hide his surprise. Then the sheriff handed us 2 hats with nets, explaining that there are many swamps in this area, and mosquitoes would be a real problem. I tried on the offered hat, and it fit quite well. Equipped with what we needed, we entered the shady thicket of the forest. The forest silence was occasionally broken only by the rustle of our steps and the distant singing of birds, which echoed among the mighty tree trunks. Sunbeams barely penetrated through the dense canopy of trees, creating a flickering pattern of light and shadow on the ground. From time to time, we encountered swampy areas that had to be circumvented to avoid getting stuck in the mud. The path proved to be challenging. The ground squelched underfoot, and in some places we had to jump from one peat bog to another to avoid getting bogged down. The forest was damp and warm, creating ideal conditions for insects. The mosquitoes were so relentless that continuing the journey without protection would have been unbearable. Fortunately, our hats with mosquito nets saved us from bites and the constant annoying buzzing around our heads. The nets snugly fit the hats, not giving mosquitoes and midges a chance to reach our skin, which significantly eased our progress through the terrain. Despite our protection, We occasionally stopped to shake off the insects that dared to settle on our backpacks and shoulders. The noise of the forest, periodically interrupted by our movements through the bushes and low branches, created a sense of complete isolation from the outside world. Along the way, we conversed with the sheriff, who sometimes tried to inquire about what we were up to. I began to evade the question, but Neil bluntly stated that it was none of his business. That put an end to the inquiries. Then he started telling us about his region and work, but there wasn't much interesting there, so I won't delve into it. As the sun began to set, we decided it was time to set up camp. Finding a cozy spot near a babbling brook, we quickly set up the tents and started a campfire. The flames quickly took hold, sparks joyfully crackling in the evening silence. The sheriff, taking on the role of cook, filled a pot with water and began cooking a stew from dried meat he brought with him. Soon a pleasant aroma wafted through the area, filling the air with delicious notes. Concerned about the possibility of attracting unwanted guests, I began to look around, trying to catch any signs of approaching wolves, but everything seemed calm. As dusk thickened and night enveloped the forest, we gathered around the campfire. The warmth of the fire and the hot stew added coziness to our evening in nature. The sounds of the nocturnal forest, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal birds created the perfect background for our warm dinner away from civilization. I relaxed a little, but then caught myself thinking that it was because I relied heavily on my partner. That wouldn't do. I needed to be vigilant and get used to independence. Otherwise, I wouldn't become a competent agent. Just as I thought about it, I heard twigs crackling in the bushes behind me. Jumping up sharply, I grabbed my rifle and aimed the barrel towards the source of the noise. My companions did the same. We stood in tense anticipation, waiting to see who would emerge. Amidst the rustle of leaves, we heard heavy breathing. Suddenly, a teenager emerged from the bushes. He limped slightly, taking uncertain and slow steps. His clothes and face bore traces of prolonged stay in the forest, dirt, stains, and minor scratches. It was the 17-year-old boy with autism mentioned by the sheriff. The teenager stopped when he noticed us. His gaze was tired and bewildered, clearly not expecting to encounter anyone in such a place. His hair was disheveled and his face bore an expression of mild confusion. He wore worn-out, dirt-covered clothes that could have once been his everyday attire. Due to his condition and visible signs of prolonged stay in the forest without proper care and food, he looked extremely tired. We slowly lowered our weapons, realizing that before us was not a threat but a lost boy in need of help. The sheriff approached him first, trying to reassure and encourage him in a soft tone. His name was Billy. We were indeed lucky to meet him on the first day. It was really fortunate considering the locals had been searching for him for weeks. The boy sat down and began to look around, sniffing the air. Obviously, he was attracted by the smell of our dinner. He seemed very hungry and followed the aroma of our dinner. Then the sheriff handed him a freshly filled plate of stew. The boy eagerly grabbed it, but upon feeling the hot dish, he abruptly overturned its contents onto the ground. He started jumping and blowing on his fingers in pain. We watched what was happening, not knowing what to do. Then Neil took another plate, put some food in it, and scooping up a spoonful, gently blew on it and brought it to the boy's mouth. He opened his mouth, swallowed the food, looking quite satisfied, and asked for more. Neil continued to feed him until he finished every last spoonful. Billy asked for more, but Neil shook his head, refusing, explaining that overeating after prolonged hunger could be harmful to health. After eating, the boy stretched, then found a spot on the grass to lie down, apparently preparing to sleep. The sheriff nudged him towards the tent and showed him how to get inside. At first he didn't want to do it, but then, after figuring it out, he crawled in and fell asleep. The boy was interesting. Surely his mother would be delighted when he returned. Now the question was what to do with him next. It was too late to go back, so Neil said we were taking him with us. After chatting by the campfire for a while, we went to sleep. The next morning, we were awakened by the sheriff's anxious shout. Peering outside, we immediately realized that he was looking for the boy. He had left at dawn and had not yet returned. We also began to call his name, and soon he emerged from the neighboring bushes, looking at us with a bewildered gaze, as if not understanding what we wanted from him. The sheriff breathed a sigh of relief. After that, we packed up, had breakfast, and continued on our way. Billy couldn't sit still. He constantly ran around the area, sometimes disappearing into the bushes and then reappearing. At first, the sheriff followed him, but then realized that he wasn't going to leave us and calmed down. As we walked, we noticed several strange things. Namely, there was no wildlife around us except for birds. We also began to notice wolf paw prints, as if they were everywhere. Soon even the birds became fewer in number. Neil speculated that the wolves were acting like a swarm of locusts, devouring everything around them and expanding their hunting radius each time. And since they had started preying on livestock on farms, soon the radius of their presence would include the town. At these words, the sheriff's eyes widened with fear. "We're talking about regular wolves, right?" he said, to which Neil just shrugged. We continued on our way, constantly looking around and searching for signs of a fallen celestial body. Soon, we stumbled upon a swamp. As we bypassed the marsh, we noticed signs of a fire ahead. We headed in that direction and noticed an iron structure that had formed a small crater as a result of the collision. It was already partially filled with water. It seemed to be parts of a rocket or a satellite. There was an incomprehensible inscription and the emblem of the USSR on it. Apparently, it had fallen into the swamp, cushioning the impact, and the fire had not spread through the forest for the same reason. The structure had a door, which was either open or broken. Neil went in first, with me following. Inside, we saw something resembling a laboratory. In the center, instead of seats, stood 3 capsules, 2 of which were broken. The third was filled with green liquid, and a strange creature floated in it. It was no bigger than a rabbit, but its forms were already beginning to take on distinctive features. The beginnings of ears, resembling wolf ears, were noticeable on its head, and its dark, closed eyes seemed too large for its face. The embryo's body was covered with thin but clearly visible gray fur, which thickened around the future neck and back. The hind and front limbs had already begun to form, with the hind ones being much more developed, indicating a future ability to run and jump. "This is a werewolf embryo," whispered Neil. I took a deep breath. Wow. I wonder what this thing is and why it fell from space. We looked around and found claw marks. Apparently, the creature that the farmer saw had escaped from here. But 2 capsules were broken, meaning there were several of them. Then we closed the door and went downstairs. The sheriff curiously examined the structure and was about to look inside, but Neil said it was a secret facility, and he shouldn't do that. He just shrugged and walked over to Billy, who was standing aside, looking at us with a slightly frightened expression. Neil pulled out a satellite phone and dialed a number. On the other end of the line, a pleasant female voice asked him about the purpose of the call. Neil asked to be connected to the Argus Watcher. "One moment," the voice replied. After some time, the same cheerful voice continued. "Hey, Neil, is that you?" "Yeah, it's me." "Argus, I have something for you. We found a fallen satellite that belonged to the Soviets. It has an inscription on it, Moon Omega 3. Can you dig up some information about it?" Neil asked. "No problem. Wait a minute." I had to dig through old archives belonging to the CIA, but what you found is indeed an interesting thing. So in the mid-1960s, under the guise of ordinary scientific activity, the communists launched the Moon Omega project. This project was extremely secretive and funded from the funds allocated for the development of new military technologies. The goal of the project was to create a group of super soldiers who could survive and operate in space. Scientific teams in several closed cities were engaged in genetic engineering and biotechnologies. Soviet scientists, based on the genes of dogs and wolves, tried to create an organism capable of adapting to space conditions. Genetic modifications included enhanced sensory abilities, increased endurance to radiation and extreme temperatures, as well as changes in behavioral patterns, making them aggressive and ruthless to enemies. The culmination of the project was the launch of the Luna Omega spacecraft, on board of which were modified animals. The satellite successfully reached orbit, and the testing phase began. However, Soviet officials concealed from the world, and even from most of their Soviet colleagues, that the spacecraft carried not just dogs, but entities that could be called true space werewolves. Information about the results of these experiments is extremely limited, but from what I managed to find out, the experiments led to unexpected and frightening consequences. The creatures displayed uncontrollable aggression, and a decision was made to sanction the emergency destruction of the satellite along with its ominous cargo. It was officially announced that Moon Omega crashed due to technical malfunctions. Apparently, some of the devices failed to be destroyed, and they flew in orbit all this time until gravity took its toll. Here is the information. If you found it, be careful. According to the records, these creatures are extremely dangerous. "Thank you, Argus. This information is really helpful," Neil replied. "No problem. Call me anytime you need," came the response. With that, the conversation ended, and we heard the female voice again, asking if we needed anything else. Neil then said, "Send us the cleaners. We found a chimera. I'll send you the coordinates. Also, send the Titan squad to the town where we are located. We need backup. Thank you, Patricia." The voice acknowledged the order and asked us to stand by. Neil put away the phone and began to think about what to do next. By the way, regarding what he said on the phone, by chimeras we mean mystical specimens that are living creatures, and Titans are a special combat unit needed to eliminate particularly dangerous entities. If they're involved, it means we're in big trouble. While we stood there contemplating what to do next, Billy became noticeably nervous. He kept looking around and pacing back and forth as if something was bothering him. The sheriff tried to find out what was wrong with him, but he didn't respond, just looked around anxiously. What's wrong with him? I looked in the direction he was staring and saw a gray blur running not far from us. I quickly pulled out my rifle and got ready. Neil did the same and motioned for the two of them to come to us. The sheriff looked at us in surprise, trying to understand what was happening, but we just told him to be ready for an attack. Soon we were surrounded. Standing next to the fallen object, we held a defensive circle against the pack of wolves. There were hundreds of them. They snarled viciously, looking at us with burning red eyes. Billy whimpered, huddling next to the sheriff. He, too, looked pale. It seemed we were doomed. Honestly, I was a little shaken too, although when we were in that town in Alaska, those creatures were more dangerous. Here we were surrounded, and I didn't know the strength of these wolves. Their strangely glowing red eyes made them truly frightening. And what if I shoot one in the head now? Will it rise again like a zombie? Anything is possible, and the unknown is even more frightening. Neil, as always, remained calm. But soon something happened that completely threw us off balance. The wolf pack parted and a werewolf strode menacingly towards us with heavy steps. He, just as the farmer described him, was 10 feet tall. Standing on his hind legs, he breathed heavily and looked at us with his red eyes. Then he growled something, and in response, we heard the wolves howling. Damn, he must have commanded something, because after that, all these creatures rushed at us. Neil reacted instantly, throwing several grenades in succession, which not only exploded with shrapnel but also emitted a special sound that drove the wolves crazy. This slightly threw off their pace, after which we opened fire. Fortunately, every time we hit them, they got up again. We kept firing, and I occasionally threw grenades. With each explosion, Billy would jump in fear and whine, which was very distracting. But no matter how much we shot, the number of wolves didn't decrease. Suddenly, I felt a shove. It was Billy who fell on me. Before I could swear at him for what he was doing, an open jaw passed over my head. One of the wolves had snuck up behind me. Damn, Billy saved me. I was grateful to him and shot my attacker. We were running out of ammo. Moreover, apparently the werewolf decided to get involved as he slowly began to move towards us. I desperately yelled to Neil, asking what to do. He seemed to be contemplating something, then ordered everyone to climb into the rocket. Surely we could hide inside. I helped the sheriff climb in first, then helped Billy and followed them. At that moment, Neil took out a metal sphere from his bag and, pressing a few buttons, threw it into the midst of the wolves. Then he jumped onto the satellite after us. Slamming the hatch, we realized that fortunately it was not damaged. It even had a lock. Locking the hatch, we found ourselves in semi-darkness. Light was coming from a small window in the fuselage and also emanated from the liquid in the capsule. So everything inside was tinted green. From above, we heard several bodies hitting the hull. Then the sounds of claws followed, but they couldn't get in here. It seemed like we were saved, but not quite. Soon the sounds of claws subsided, and the structure shook. Apparently, the werewolf jumped on top of it. Then we felt a blow. A loud bang echoed through the area, and the whole structure vibrated. Then came a second blow. It seemed like this creature would punch a hole in it any moment. We waited in fear of our fate, when suddenly there was an explosion from outside, accompanied by some high-frequency sound, making us cover our ears, and outside we heard a plaintive howl. The blows stopped. It seemed this creature had fled. We waited for some time, then decided to look outside. It was quiet. Only the dead bodies of wolves remained. The rest had fled. I looked at the spot where Neil threw the sphere and noticed a large concentration of bodies. Well, that's good. I helped the others climb out, and we descended to the ground. What to do next was just to wait. We called for backup, and they should arrive soon. The sheriff collapsed on the grass, powerless. What happened really shocked him. Billy, on the other hand, nervously ran around. Did he sense danger again? We decided to inspect the surroundings, and soon I heard Neil's cry, calling me and the sheriff. Approaching him, we saw that he was leaning over a multitude of tracks leading in one direction. My partner turned to the sheriff, asking about the direction of the town, to which he pointed out the direction the tracks were leading. It became clear that the wolves were planning to attack the town. One observation was as follows. The animals were skinny, apparently in dire need of food. They acted like locusts, devouring everything around them. All of this, perhaps, was not accidental. Perhaps they had an accelerated metabolism, or the main werewolf drew energy from its victims. But the fact remained. They needed more food. The sheriff panicked, not knowing what to do. Communication here wasn't working. Then he remembered Neil's phone. Without further ado, Neil handed it to the sheriff and suggested gathering all the townsfolk in one place, preferably one that could be barricaded. Then the sheriff remembered the cultural center. It was spacious enough. It could easily accommodate 400 people. He dialed his deputy's phone number, explained the situation, and ordered the evacuation of all local residents. After that, we headed towards the town. This time, our group moved much faster. We didn't need to look for landmarks. It was enough to follow the numerous tracks. We were afraid Billy would slow us down, but he kept pace with us. After walking for half a day, we took a short break. After a quick snack, we continued on our way. As dusk approached, we reached the town. Here the tracks scattered in different directions. Apparently, the wolves dispersed in search of prey, most likely starting to operate on farms. This gave us a slight time advantage. Entering the town, we found that the wolves weren't here yet. We headed towards the cultural center building, where people were already at work. Some were nailing windows shut, others simply stood, not understanding what was happening. Approaching closer, we saw Frank and the sheriff's deputy who were actively barricading the building. Frank worked especially hard. He had encountered these creatures before and knew what to expect. A woman passed by us. It was Billy's mother. Seeing her son, she rushed to embrace him, crying tears of joy and saying, "I knew you were alive." But Billy stood there as if not recognizing her, not understanding what was happening. He seemed about to push her away, but she held on to him so tightly that he relented, standing silently, waiting for her to calm down. We watched this scene, happy for them. Then Neil headed towards the car where we had additional weapons. Time was running short. The wolves could attack at any moment. Meanwhile, I helped fortify the barricades. When Neil returned, we were done. We ordered everyone inside. The sheriff and his deputy brought more weapons, and several dozen volunteers joined us. We dispersed them across the rooftops and began setting explosives. One of the farmers brought a couple of sheep, which we tied to stakes on the road. It wasn't humane to use them as bait, but there were 400 people nearby who needed saving. I was surprised how quickly the locals organized and believed what we told them. It was probably thanks to the sheriff, who had immense authority in the area. Once we were ready, we took our places on the rooftop of the adjacent building. By then, it was already dark, but thankfully the streetlights illuminated the area. We didn't have to wait long. Soon we heard howls nearby, and shadows started appearing in the streets. I put on my thermal goggles and involuntarily gasped. There were hundreds of wolves. It seemed like even more than we had seen before. We had killed quite a few of them, and I thought it might make the upcoming fight easier, but I was wrong. They roamed the area, and it seemed like the swarm of those red dots would engulf the entire town. Several volunteers nearby exclaimed in surprise. One of them asked if there had ever been so many wolves in this area. I also wondered about it. Where did they all come from? But the answer remained a mystery for now. Seeing the tethered sheep, the wolves rushed towards them, forming a massive crowd fighting aggressively for every piece. I shuddered at the thought that it could have been a person in their place. I turned to Neil, expecting him to activate the detonators, but he waited patiently. When more wolves gathered, several powerful explosions rang out. The animals scattered in all directions, some torn apart. Immediately after the explosions, gunfire erupted from all the rooftop hideouts. Wolves fell by the dozens, some hit by grenades. Their numbers began to gradually diminish, though it seemed like there were still many. We kept firing. The wolves couldn't reach us, and they started to despair. Panic gripped the streets below, but then a howl echoed, sending shivers down our spines. Neil radioed everyone to cease fire and take cover in the buildings, not to provoke this creature. We didn't need civilian casualties. So only we, along with the sheriff and his deputy, remained on the rooftop. Neil kept shooting, and I asked him what if the creature ran towards us. He replied, "That's our job." Well, here it comes. Grumbling a bit, I continued firing. The number of wolves rapidly decreased. Soon the werewolf appeared before us. It moved swiftly and was quite agile. It seemed it had been playing with us before or thought we couldn't escape. But this time, we saw it in all its glory. The sheriff uttered only one phrase. "Damn commies, what have they done?" Yes, it was a horrifying sight. While we were shocked, Neil pulled out a huge high-caliber rifle. After loading it, he took aim. When the werewolf approached, a loud shot rang out, throwing it back. It seemed like we had killed it, but it got up again, glaring at us, then leaping towards our direction, dodging bullets. Another shot rang out, hitting it again, but it was difficult to stop this monster. It became even more enraged, howling as it continued its charge. More shots followed, but to no avail. I was already praying to the gods, thinking we were done for when the creature climbed onto our building. But suddenly several trucks drove onto the street, and armed men in black uniforms leaped out. I squinted and saw they were covered in shiny black scales. Neil breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Finally, they've arrived." They were titans. The werewolf noticed them too and stopped, seemingly changing its target. Then it lunged towards them. The wolves attacked our reinforcements, but it was futile. Their suits provided excellent protection. Some of them fired guns, while others wielded swords, beheading the approaching creatures. When they saw the approaching monster, those behind the trucks pulled out huge cannons. I even whistled when I saw them. Without hesitation, they started firing at the creature, causing immense damage. Clearly in pain, the werewolf turned and ran towards the building where the residents were. "Oh no!" Neil exclaimed, and aimed his gun, joining the barrage. But the creature reached the door and knocked it down with a powerful blow. Nobody was on the threshold, only Billy and his mother, who tried to pull him inside. But he stood there as if feeling nothing, then gently pushed his mother aside, sending her flying. The werewolf stood, staring at him, then roared and lunged at him. Then something unexpected happened. Billy also jumped towards it, transforming in mid-air. His clothes turned into fur, he elongated, his claws grew, and his face changed. He turned into a werewolf. Colliding, they rolled down the street, scratching and biting each other. So that's where the one from the second capsule went. He had been with us all this time. From beside me, I heard Neil whisper, "It was a shapeshifter after all." We continued to watch the fight, which seemed to be nearing its end. We had severely wounded the first werewolf, giving the second an advantage. In the end, the second one raised its paw and with a powerful blow tore off the first one's head. Then it rolled down the street. The second one, in an adrenaline rush, howled at the moon. Then it began to transform the familiar lad once again. After the death of the leader, the other wolves seemed to snap out of it and started dispersing. We descended and approached Billy. The Titans surrounded him, keeping him at bay. But Neil nudged one of them aside and slipped into the circle. I followed suit. Approaching Billy, we looked into his eyes and saw that he wasn't a threat. Neil ordered everyone to stand down. After patting the lad on the shoulder, he led him towards one of the trucks. There, he spoke with one of our people and seated Billy in the vehicle, who didn't resist. When Neil returned, I asked him what would happen to the lad next. He replied that they would study him, and if he posed no danger, perhaps they would return him to his mother. At least Neil would insist on it. Most likely the real Billy was already dead. Nevertheless, this creature would receive care and would always be under our close surveillance. Our agency isn't a soulless killing machine. Even such beings are entitled to life. After his words, I suddenly remembered that town in Alaska which we nearly destroyed. Soon, the cleaners arrived at the scene. People in gray jumpsuits with no identifying marks. They immediately began their work, collecting the carcasses of the dead animals and the werewolf. Among them were special agents in purple jumpsuits known as erasers. Using hypnosis, they erased the memories of all eyewitnesses, resorting to special amulets. These amulets apparently contained some mechanism or substance that activated forgetfulness upon contact or sight. I don't know why, but I didn't like those guys. Maybe because as soon as you befriend someone, that someone immediately forgets about you. At that moment, the sheriff approached us. Watching what was happening, he said, "Did you see what's going on here?" Fortunately, there were no casualties. I definitely won't forget this incident. "You'll forget," Neil whispered, noticing a memory eraser hurrying towards us from behind.
Story 3.
On the way to the excavation site of a new metro section, we were accompanied only by dim flashlights. The noise from the operating equipment grew louder, echoing in the concrete walls of the tunnel. Strangely, there were no workers around, so there were only 3 of us. Myself, Neil, and our guide, a local foreman named Jake. Jake turned out to be a rather pleasant person. I noticed that often the most responsive people work in fields where interpersonal communication is minimal. Perhaps every time someone talks to them, they are so glad for the interaction that they give their all to the conversation. Jake enthusiastically and with lively gestures told us about what had happened, wondering how we had learned about the incident since they hadn't had time to inform anyone yet. "Here's what happened. When the workers were digging the soil, they stumbled upon an ancient stone door adorned with writings and drawings. Putting in effort, they pushed it aside, revealing a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Then the bravest among them decided to check what was inside. However, literally a minute later, he jumped out saying that there was something alive in there. And he, by the way, did the right thing by running away immediately. As an expert, let me advise you, never explore what happened if something horrifying occurs. For example, if you see a pile of rags under which something with an unrecognizable limb protrudes, never ever check what's there. It's better to turn around 180 degrees and run away. Soon we reached a temporary wooden staircase installed along the shaft. Everything around was covered in a layer of dust and clay, reminding us of the seriousness and scale of the work being done here. Upon reaching the bottom of the tunnel, we found ourselves in a large open space where excavators and other heavy machinery stood idle. The air smelled of metal and earth. There was an unusual silence at the excavation site, as if all work had suddenly stopped. The only sign of life was a group of people standing in the corner, discussing something animatedly among themselves. When we approached, Jake shouted for everyone to disperse. The workers grumbled as they parted, clearing the way for us. Before us stood a granite wall with a massive stone door in the center, every square inch of which was skillfully carved and detailed. The door depicted angels with outstretched wings battling demonic figures, embodying the eternal struggle between good and evil. Angels, depicted in various battle poses with swords and shields, expressed determination and courage. Their faces radiated nobility and compassion, while the faces of the demons were distorted with anger and aggression, creating a sense of tense confrontation. Latin inscriptions were inscribed between the figures of angels and demons, possibly containing quotes from the Holy Scriptures or apocalyptic prophecies, executed in an elegant, ornate script. These texts seemed like prayers or incantations meant to empower the angels in their holy war. Decorative ornaments and symbols were carved around the door, possibly representing Christian virtues or spiritual elements, adding a layer of symbolism to the depicted battle scene. These ornaments could symbolize protection and the sacred mission entrusted to the angels. Neil approached closer and began to feel these symbols, murmuring something to himself. He stood there for a while, then turned to us with a frightened face and ordered everyone to leave this place. His reaction scared me because I had never seen him afraid of anything before. It seemed serious. Jake started commanding the workers to hurry up. There was murmuring and discontent, but everyone rushed to leave. I approached him and asked what had happened. He replied, "Apparently something dangerous is sealed here, and now we need to understand whether we woke up what was sleeping there or not." His voice was troubled. What could have been hidden there? While I examined the frescoes, Neil said he needed to make a call and headed upstairs. I stayed behind to guard the entrance. For some reason he didn't return. There was no communication underground, and I remained unaware. Wandering through the tunnel, I found a chair lying near a tent, and picking it up, I headed to the entrance to the catacombs. I got bored. I had already examined the frescoes and inscriptions, and no matter how much I looked at them, I couldn't understand anything useful. So, sitting on the chair, I took out my phone and started reading a book I had downloaded earlier. The story was quite interesting. At the point where the main character was fighting his enemy and the climax was about to happen, I heard a sound from the open gap of the door, which we still couldn't close. What's that? I looked around, no one was there. Listening carefully, I realized the sound was coming from inside the tomb. Turning on my flashlight, I quietly approached and directed the beam of light inside. Before me was an ancient room adorned with frescoes. On the opposite side stood two statues resembling angels guarding the entrance, which led to a long corridor. I don't know what was at the end of it. The beam of light didn't reach there. While inspecting the room, I passed the light past the corner, but then quickly returned. There was something in the corner. A figure resembling a human, naked, covered in some thick, rough skin, like stone. It was huddled in the corner with its back to me, and when the beam of light hit it, it turned irritably. The creature was hairless, with no nose, two large slits in its place. Its mouth was wide, with rows of large, sharp teeth. Its hands were huge, with long claws on its fingers. It was holding the remains of a rat that it had been gnawing on. Seeing this sight, I dropped the flashlight in shock, but quickly picked it up again and illuminated the room. But the creature was no longer there. It seems it went down that corridor. I recognized it. It was a ghoul. These creatures like to inhabit places where there are human corpses, feeding on them. It was my first time encountering one. Honestly, the sight was quite creepy. I took the safety off my gun, ready to defend myself. Neil still hadn't returned. Where the hell did he disappear to? Suddenly, I heard strange sounds from inside again. It was a clicking sound, and it was getting closer and closer to the door. I prepared my weapon, expecting it to emerge any moment, but it seemed that this creature, or whatever it was, decided to turn around and go back. I breathed a sigh of relief. It seems this place is indeed dangerous. After waiting for another half an hour, I finally saw my partner descending down the stairs, accompanied by a rather strange-looking man. He was dressed in a long cloak that reached down to the floor, wearing garlic head necklaces and a huge silver cross hanging down, probably the size of 2 palms. He had a peculiar hat adorned with various inscriptions. Behind the two of them walked a group of people dressed in black uniforms covered in scales, holding weapons. I recognized them as Titans, a special combat unit of our agency. As they approached me, the strange man immediately began examining the frescoes on the door. Looking at Neil, I nodded my head towards this odd character, silently asking who he was. Neil replied that he's our main vampire specialist, and his name is Chesterfield Grimsley. Though he looks and behaves oddly, he's a professional in his field. The man continued scrutinizing the fresco while I told Neil about encountering the ghoul. He nodded, saying that apparently we will encounter more creatures there. Soon Chesterfield, let's just call him Chester, finished examining the inscriptions and approached me, extending his hand to introduce himself. I awkwardly shook it, saying my name is Mike. He then said that this place is indeed dangerous, and it's possible that it's the work of the Order of Celestial Warriors. These guys only took on matters that could threaten all of humanity. But what's interesting is that this organization disappeared without a trace 40 years ago. No one knows what happened, but some say they might have perished fighting an unimaginably powerful foe. The question is, what did they seal in this place? That's what we were about to find out. Neil called for backup, so we'll be pushing forward with force. I was given a special rifle loaded with silver bullets, along with a couple of magazines. Armed, we approached the door, accompanied by 5 more Titans, while the rest were to guard the exit. Applying force, we shifted the stone slab and entered inside. No one was there. Then Neil led the way, and we passed by the stone statues of angels, entering the corridor. It was made of bricks of white granite and had an arched shape. Rodin and lizard bones littered the floor. As we walked along, we came across niches along the walls where busts of angels stood, some of which were broken. Soon, we encountered inscriptions made in blood. Some were written small, others covered the entire ceiling and walls. The inscriptions were in Latin, which unfortunately I hadn't yet learned. Neil said they were blasphemous curses written here and didn't bother translating them for me. Who could have left them the ghoul? But they usually have very low intellect. We continued moving forward, occasionally stopping to listen to the surrounding sounds. Soon we reached a fork. The corridor split into 3 paths. Chester, whom we looked at for guidance, simply shrugged. Then Neil chose the far left passage without hesitation. Following him, we soon found ourselves in a large hall, with doors to various rooms lining the walls of the corridor. Extinguished candles stood on either side of the corridor, their wicks seeming to wait for sparks to ignite again. A strange, viscous atmosphere hung in the air, penetrating to the bone. Absolute darkness only intensified the feeling of unease, and I constantly expected someone to pounce on me from the dark corner. We began checking the rooms one by one, but most of them turned out to be empty. Soon Chester called us into one of them. As we entered, our eyes fell on a strange and ominous sight. A circle of skeletons kneeling. Each skeleton faced towards the center, where on a low stone pedestal lay a tarnished metal book, its pages turned towards the heavens, as if praying for something lost and irreplaceable. The light from our flashlights cast long shadows on the walls, making the skeletons seem alive, flickering in the light and shadow, as if they had just frozen in their prayers. The cobwebs covering their bones glinted in the light, adding even more sinister atmosphere to the scene. The room was silent, broken only by the scurrying of rats fleeing from the light and our footsteps. An indescribable sense of fear and foreboding permeated the air, as if something terrible had once happened in this place. Some of the skeletons still held remnants of rosaries or ancient amulets in their bony fingers, as if trying to protect their souls from the evil they encountered in their final prayer. Examining the room, we felt the empty eye sockets of the skeletons watching our every move, as if warning or forewarning of something dreadful to come. Chester approached the pedestal to examine the book, and after inspecting it, said that it simply filled with prayers. It seemed to have no significance, but he carefully covered it with cloth and put it into his backpack. After that, we left and continued our search. We approached the next door. Strange, disgusting sounds emanated from inside, reminiscent of wet suction cups attaching to a smooth surface. These sounds filled us with dread, making our hearts beat faster. Carefully, armed and ready, we prepared for the worst. As we slowly opened the door, we were met with a menacing sight. The room was shrouded in thick shadows, and in the dim light, the ceiling swarmed with hideous creatures. They resembled octopuses, but their bodies were covered in hard, shiny skin. The mouths of these creatures were full of sharp, razor-like teeth, and from beneath their glowing red eyes flickered with malice. From their tentacles, suction cups attached to the ceiling occasionally detached, creating the repulsive sound we heard from outside. Hundreds of such creatures moved along the ceiling, creating the illusion of a living, pulsating mass, which further intensified our horror. The air in the room was cold and damp, and every step we took echoed, seemingly awakening even more creatures. At that moment, one of the Titans, without hesitation, took action. He armed himself with a flamethrower and, with cold calmness, began spraying streams of fire around the room. Bright tongues of flame illuminated the walls, reflecting off the damp stone masonry and scorching the monstrous octopuses, which fell to the ground in agony, emitting horrifying sounds. We stood aside, watching this saving but terrifying sight. Occasionally, we fired shots, killing those creatures that tried to escape outside. When half of them had already been destroyed, something unexpected happened. The remaining part broke away from the ceiling and lunged at the Titan. It seemed to anticipate this and directed a stream towards them. But still, a large number fell on him, sinking their teeth into him. He remained calm. His protective scales saved him from any damage. I heard that they're made from the skin of some creature grown in our agency. Then I remembered I was dressed in regular army fabric, and I thought to ask for such gear myself. Meanwhile, the creatures tried to devour him, and another warrior with a flamethrower intervened. He aimed it at his comrade and doused him with a fiery stream. All the creatures burned and fell to the ground. The first agent stood as if nothing had happened. It seemed like the fire had no effect on him. I felt an even stronger desire to have that kind of suit. After we wiped out those creatures, we explored the remaining rooms, but found nothing. So we decided to return to the intersection and explore the second passage. As we proceeded along it, we found ourselves in a vast crypt where darkness seemed almost tangible. The space was filled with thousands of graves, laid out in endless, grim symmetry. Each tomb was neatly marked, but the inscriptions on the stone slabs were barely discernible, worn away by time and humidity. We slowly walked along these grim rows, hearing only the sound of our footsteps echoing in the cold air of this dismal place. The air was heavy and damp, tainted with the smell of decay and old mold. The dim light from our flashlights barely penetrated the dense darkness, creating long shadows that seemed alive. The underground chamber resembled an unfinished painting by an old master, depicting a vision of sorrow and decay. Rustles and strange sounds emanating from unexplored corners of the crypt made us flinch and turn. but there was nothing there except shadows and darkness. Sometimes it felt like unknown creatures could leap out at us from behind each tomb. The echo of our footsteps and the whispers of our voices reverberated off the walls of the crypt, creating the impression that someone was whispering back. The nervous tension grew with every meter we traversed, compounded by a sense of inevitability and oblivion awaiting us in the depths of this gloomy place. As soon as we passed the rows of graves, the ground suddenly trembled beneath our feet. Moments later, a creature erupted from one of the tombs with an explosion. A ghoul, an embodiment of terror, burst forth from its underground lair, hurling bones and earth in all directions. It was the same creature I had seen before. It immediately launched into an attack. Chester quickly drew a pair of pistols hidden beneath his cloak and began firing at the assailant. Bullets crackled through the air, but the ghoul evaded them with astonishing agility, using the darkness and nearby graves as cover. Neil, having dodged aside at the first attack, also opened fire. He aimed and fired in bursts, trying to anticipate the ghoul's movements. However, the creature, despite its clumsiness, was incredibly fast and seemed to anticipate the trajectory of the bullets. The battle unfolded with incredible intensity. The ghoul didn't just evade. It attacked, darting out of the darkness to deliver swift blows, then retreating among the graves. This creature was no ordinary undead. Its movements were calculated and cunning. It used the landscape of the crypt, maneuvering among the graves and old stone slabs to gain advantage. The Titans spread out to cover more ground and limit the ghoul's maneuverability. Chester signaled to the rest of the group, coordinating their actions, trying to encircle the ghoul or lure it into open space. The tension in the air reached its peak as the ghoul, realizing it was trapped, launched into one final attack. At that moment, Neil, seizing the element of surprise, managed to precisely shoot one of the ghoul's less protected areas. The bullet hit the creature's neck, causing it to slow down. Seizing the opportunity, Chester made several well-placed shots, each finding its mark. Injured and weakened, the ghoul finally fell, no longer able to rise. We, catching our breath, cautiously approached the fallen enemy, ensuring that the threat had been neutralized. The smell of gunpowder and adrenaline lingered in the air, and our hearts still raced from the tension we had just experienced. I breathed a sigh of relief. It had been a truly tense battle. Apparently, this creature emerged in this crypt due to the abundance of graves. We hadn't yet figured out where they come from, so the body needed to be preserved. One of the agents pulled out a special bag, human-sized, and we packed the remains of this creature into it. For now, we'll leave it here, and then we'll come back. Continuing our journey through the gloomy catacombs, we soon came across a monumental obelisk carved from dark stone. On its surface were engraved ancient symbols and an inscription that read, "Catacombs of the Martyrs." The words evoked a sense of grandeur and tragedy, reminding us of those who were buried here many centuries ago. What could it mean? There was no further description. After inspecting every corner of the place, we found nothing of interest and finally decided to proceed to the third passage. As we entered it, we saw a red glow ahead. Soon, we emerged into a vast cavern, in the center of which was a large lake. It was emitting this red glow. Approaching closer, I leaned down to look at the water. It seemed transparent but tinged with a red hue, while the glow emanated from the bottom. We looked around. It was impossible to bypass this water obstacle. But soon, we spotted a small pier where a boat was docked, with an angel bust at the bow. Neil said it seemed we needed to cross to the other side on it. Slowly and cautiously, we boarded the boat, which barely rocked on the surface of the huge red glowing lake. The light emanating from its depths enveloped us in a soft but ominous glow, creating the impression that the water was filled with something mystical and ancient. Neil, taking the oar, began to row slowly, disturbing the silence with the light splashing of water. The rest of us followed his lead, trying to maintain balance and not disrupt the fragile stability of the boat. Silence reigned around us, interrupted only by the sounds of our oars and the faint echo bouncing off the towering walls of the cavern. As we crossed the lake, I noticed an unusual movement beneath the surface of the water. At first, it seemed like just a shadow or an illusion caused by the strange light. But the shadow quickly grew in size and took the form of a long serpentine creature smoothly gliding beneath our boat. God, not again. Is there some kind of wildlife lurking in every corner here? Before we could react in any way, a huge creature erupted from the water with a crash and splash, resembling a salamander. Its body was covered in slick, shiny scales, glowing red from the lake's light. The creature's eyes, cold and calculating, cast a scorching gaze upon us, while its wide-open mouth gleamed with 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth. The salamander struck the side of our boat with force, trying to overturn it. Neil, keeping his composure, attempted to push it away with the oar, but the creature was too fast and agile, twisting and evading the blows. In the midst of the struggle, as the salamander attacked again, our boat began to tilt, threatening to capsize. I, trying to regain balance, leaned sharply to the opposite side, but this action only worsened the situation. Seizing the moment, the salamander attacked again, this time aiming straight at me. Acting instinctively, Chester fired at the attacking creature. The loud gunshot echoed through the cave, and the bullet hit the salamander's side, eliciting an angry and painful cry. The creature recoiled into the water but soon resurfaced, trying to overturn our boat again. We all held onto the boat's sides tightly, trying to maintain balance. Neil, recovering from the initial shock, grabbed the oar and struck the salamander on the head with force. The creature howled in pain and backed off, but its attacks grew more aggressive. At that moment, another salamander emerged from the water, unnoticed until now. Now the struggle intensified with renewed vigor. Desperately fighting for our lives, we opened fire from all weapons. Chester, holding a pistol in one hand, used the other to steady the boat, while shooting at the attacking salamanders. One of the shots hit the creature's eye, causing it to retreat with a piercing shriek. Every second of this battle felt like an eternity. The tension reached its peak as the salamanders, mustering their last strength, simultaneously attacked the boat from both sides, trying to overturn it. Together, we all lunged to the opposite sides of the boat, trying to balance it and avoid disaster. It was a struggle not only against the creatures but also against the watery element itself. However, despite our efforts, one of the salamanders managed to wedge its powerful jaws under the boat's edge. Together we made one final determined push, and using a distracting maneuver, Chester and Neil simultaneously attacked the creature from different sides. Neil jabbed the remainder of the broken oar into the salamander's side, while Chester fired at the vulnerable spot under its chest. With a groan and an agonizing wail, the salamanders retreated, disappearing into the murky depths of the lake. Shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, we slowly continued our journey to the other shore. Approaching the dock, we were all grateful for the opportunity to set foot on solid ground. Wow, what awaits us next? It feels like we've stumbled into some dungeon crawling with all sorts of creatures. After catching our breath from the tense journey across the lake, we continued on our path and soon found ourselves in a long corridor, its walls adorned with frescoes and inscriptions carved into the stone. These finely crafted images and texts represented a true artistic legacy frozen in time. Chester, with his experience and knowledge of history and mythology, began to carefully study the frescoes and inscriptions. He soon found key information about the figure occupying a central place in the images and texts. It was a demon vampire named Marbel, known for his thirst for human blood. According to the inscriptions, Marbel was a powerful creature whose actions led to numerous human casualties. The history described how angels and their devoted followers engaged in a battle with the demon to put an end to his atrocities. These battles were depicted on the frescoes with magnificent detail, showing angels descending from heaven to confront Marbel. In the end, after a long and exhausting struggle, the angels and their followers managed to defeat Marbel and imprison him in these catacombs. The inscriptions warned that if Marbel ever broke free from his confinement, he would unleash a plague upon humanity, leading to its inevitable demise. Chester shared this information with us, and we realized with alarm that the place we were in held a huge threat. The inscription also contained a warning and a call for caution, pointing out the safety measures that needed to be followed to avoid awakening the demon. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, we decided to continue moving, but with even greater caution, examining every corner for possible traps or mechanisms. Continuing our journey through the dark catacombs, we finally reached a place that Chester called the Cursed Crypt. This section of the underground was particularly ominous. The air here was saturated with a thick, almost palpable sense of evil and a premonition of death. The crypt was large, its stone walls adorned with Gothic arches and carved frescoes depicting scenes of vampire hunting and destruction. In the center of the room stood a grim pillar to which the body of a vampire was nailed. The vampire was dressed in tattered remnants of what once was his attire, his gaunt features dimly glowing, expressing eternal agony. His hands and feet were bound with thick, rusty chains, and a large wooden stake was driven into his heart. A grim glow emanated from beneath his closed lids, and it seemed that every detail in this place whispered of his torments and the evil he once sowed. The walls of the crypt were adorned with spells and ritual symbols designed to keep the vampire in a state of eternal confinement. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was only interrupted by a faint draft that swept through the crypt, causing the flames of the candles to flicker in a chaotic dance of shadows. It was at this moment that we noticed the first signs of awakening. Slowly, barely discernible movements began to appear in the vampire's fingers. His eyes twitched slightly under his lids, and the glow around his body became more intense, as if an internal force had begun to fill his long, dormant body again. In the tense silence, each of our breaths seemed loud and sharp. We involuntarily stepped back, realizing that we must be extremely cautious. Understanding that the vampire could break free at any moment and once again pose a threat to the world made us vigilant and prepared for any developments. But what were we to do next? Drive another stake? At that moment, Chester pulled out the book wrapped in cloth from his bag, and looking at the vampire, he began to read. His voice, initially calm and confident, gradually filled with power. It sounded like an ancient resonance, echoes of which reverberated along the walls of the crypt. At that moment, the vampire suddenly snapped his eyes open. They emitted a malicious red glow, and he let out a piercing scream so powerful that it stirred up a huge gust of wind in response. Whirlwinds of wind swept through the corridors, stirring up dust and small stones, but Chester continued to read. With each word of the incantation, the vampire became more and more frantic. He made a gesture with his hand, and his eyes flashed even brighter with red light. With words that sounded like an ancient and forgotten language, ghouls began to materialize out of the void. These creatures, semi-decomposed, with rotting flesh and a thirst for blood, moved towards us to protect their master. Our group quickly armed ourselves and prepared to repel the attack. Neil and I, armed with rifles, opened fire on the approaching creatures. The echoes of gunfire reverberated through the dark corridors of the crypt, with each volley carrying the hope of stopping the undead before they could reach Chester. I, holding a pistol, aimed and fired at the nearest ghouls, trying to prevent them from getting too close to our defensive circle. Bullets whistled through the air, embedding themselves in the decaying flesh of our enemies, causing them to retreat or fall lifeless onto the cold stone floor. Meanwhile, the Titans, members of our group equipped with flamethrowers, joined the fray. Jets of fire erupted from their weapons, engulfing the space in front of us and turning ghouls into living torches. The stench of burning flesh filled the air, and the groans and cries of the burning creatures created a horrifying symphony of terror. The entire battle was filled with chaos, where every shot and every stream of fire brought us closer to victory or defeat. The ghouls, although weakened by our fire, continued to advance, trying to break through our line of defense. When they got too close, the Titans took them on in hand-to-hand combat. Meanwhile, Chester, standing in the center of the circle, continued to read the spell with incredible concentration. His voice grew louder and more insistent. The light emanating from his book began to flicker more strongly, forming a protective barrier around us. Every word he uttered was a blow to the enemy forces, and gradually, the ghouls began to lose their strength and power. When the last of the ghouls fell, engulfed in the fiery inferno of the flamethrowers, the vampire realized that it was the end. Then something unexpected happened. He let out a furious scream, and his head detached from his body. 8 spider-like legs emerged from where his neck had been, and in the place where his head connected to his neck, hundreds of small spores dangled. It seemed as if they were insect eggs by the thousands. The vampire's head leaped and skillfully landed on the ceiling, then ran along it towards the exit. Meanwhile, his body, suspended on the pillar, began to dry up right before our eyes. The situation unfolded so swiftly that we barely had time to comprehend what was happening. The vampire's head, now possessing monstrous spider-like legs, quickly moved along the catacomb ceiling, dodging our shots with incredible agility and speed. Chester, shouting a cry, led us in pursuit, and we ran after it, dispersing the darkness with the light of our flashlights. The pursuit was filled with adrenaline. The air in the catacombs corridors became heavy and dense from the shooting and panic. The vampire's head eluded us like a ghost flickering ahead, disappearing at one of the numerous turns, and then reappearing before our eyes. Its movements were chaotic and unpredictable, making it difficult to hit. We ran, trying not to fall behind, overcoming obstacles such as debris-blocked sections or low-hanging arches. Our breath was heavy, and our hearts beat in unison with our rapid steps. Our shouts and the sounds of gunfire echoed through the corridors. Despite the rapid pursuit, the vampire's head still managed to elude us, making short bursts and zigzags. Its ability to move across the ceiling gave it an advantage we couldn't fully counter. Soon we found ourselves by a lake. We jumped into a boat while the head ran across the ceiling and soon disappeared from view. Chester and Neil cursed in turn, and I tried to understand what had happened as we sailed. The vampire hunter explained to me that the spores under the head could infect people, and then the vampires would proliferate across the planet. This was the very warning we had found on the frescoes. Now, under no circumstances must we let this creature get away, or it would be the end for us. When we reached the opposite shore, we rushed to the exit. We heard gunfire ahead. As we emerged from the catacombs, we saw that the remaining titans were shooting at the head, but it dodged skillfully and jumped outside. We chased after it. But suddenly, Neil stopped abruptly. I asked him what was wrong, but he frowned, pondering something. Then he said, "If you think about it, where would this creature go if it wanted to spread these spores faster? They couldn't be airborne, so it needed water. That means we should head to the water treatment station." And indeed, since we had already lost it, we needed to anticipate its moves and pray that our guess was correct. Arriving at the site, we found the station to seem calm, and nothing indicated the presence of the monster. However, we did not relax. Quickly surveying the area, we chose strategic positions for an ambush. Neil and Chester took positions on the roof of one of the station buildings to oversee and control the surrounding area. I and the remaining Titans positioned ourselves near the main entrances and exits of the water treatment facilities, ready to open fire at any moment. We set traps and used night vision cameras to monitor movement. Each of us was armed and ready for battle. Our strategy was aimed at immediately reacting in case the vampire appeared and preventing it from achieving its sinister goals. As we waited, the tension grew. The air was cool, and a light breeze carried the sounds of the night. Time dragged slowly, each rustle making us strain our ears and grip our weapons tighter. Chester occasionally updated us on the situation through the radio, keeping our combat readiness. Suddenly, the motion sensors activated on one of the station's flanks. Chester signaled over the radio, and we all immediately focused on the source of the alarm. Shadows slipped between the buildings, and the next moment, the vampire's head, still agile and fast, appeared from around the corner. Neil opened fire, trying to stop it before it could enter the building. The head dodged the bullets with amazing agility and tried to escape in another direction. But the Titans, armed with flamethrowers, created a barrier of fire blocking its path. The head jumped back, trying to find another route, but at that moment Chester, descending from the roof, finally cut off its path, firing several accurate shots from his rifle. The vampire head, besieged from all sides, desperately searched for a way to escape. The Titan's flamethrowers created a wall of flame, forcing the creature to bounce back each time it tried to break through. Chester, using his high position and shooting experience, fired volley after volley trying to stun or wound the monster, but it still dodged with incredible agility. At that moment, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Grabbing a specially prepared bomb designed to fight such creatures, I crept closer. The head momentarily focused on the other team members, distracted by a new burst of flame, and that was all I needed. With maximum precision, I tossed the bomb right at it, aiming at the spot where it had previously been attached to the body. The bomb activated immediately upon hitting the surface, and the explosive wave filled the air with the sound of cracking and screeching. A bright flash of light illuminated the night darkness, and the head, caught in the epicenter of the explosion, was finally destroyed. After the head exploded, a bright red flash lit up the sky. The explosion blinded me for a moment, and when I could open my eyes again, I found myself in an entirely different place. It was something akin to space. A boundless, star-filled expanse with neither ground beneath my feet nor sky above. In this timeless space hovered a terrifying creature resembling a demon. This demon looked like a leech, but had arms and legs, making it even more sinister. Its red eyes glowed with evil thirst, and its long, writhing limbs stretched toward me, as if trying to grab and drag me into the abyss. I felt that this was the end, and I experienced a cold horror of impending fate. But then I felt some wind, a warm and soothing breeze that suddenly began to blow on my face and hands. Turning around, I saw behind me a radiance, shining brighter than 1,000 suns. From this light emerged wings, illuminated so brightly that I could not discern who or what was the source of this light. The appearance of this radiance clearly stunned the demon. It faltered, its limbs freezing in the air, and its red eyes momentarily lost their malevolent gleam. Using this chance, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, gathering strength. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the floor near the water treatment station. My comrades leaned over me, concernedly examining my condition. The air around was full of the smell of ozone and char from the explosion, which apparently had transported me to that strange reality. I tried to stand up, still feeling the aftertaste of that unusual wind and light that had saved me from the inevitable. Now, having come to my senses, I told my comrades about my vision, and we all looked at each other, understanding that perhaps some higher power had helped us. But who or what it was remained only a guess. Chester pondered my words as if guessing whom I might have met. I also had speculations about where all these creatures on our planet might come from. Maybe someday we'll be able to uncover the truth, but for now, I was glad to have survived. Story 4. Neil and I were driving down the highway leading to a small village called Whitehall, tucked away in a remote corner of Michigan. Neil confidently held the wheel, his eyes focused on the road, while I, sitting beside him, was engrossed in an article on my phone. The article narrated a strange and frightening incident that had occurred the previous day in this quiet village. The Miller family gathered for breakfast, as usual, yesterday morning. It was a gray, uneventful day, except for one circumstance. The previous day, they had buried their beloved grandmother. The loss was still fresh in their hearts, and the mood at the table was somber. Everyone slowly chewed their cereal, lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, a new guest walked into the kitchen and shamelessly sat down next to them, starting to eat. The guest turned out to be the grandmother they had buried the day before. The family was stunned. They stared at her, unable to believe their eyes. But what struck them most were her eyes, empty, lifeless, like two black holes. In shock and horror, they jumped up from the table, screaming, "Zombie!" and scattering in all directions. When the police arrived, the grandmother was nowhere to be found. The skepticism of many locals was shattered by the facts. Surveillance footage confirmed every word of the Millers. At present, no one knows where the grandmother is or who was impersonating her. Perhaps it was a prank played by someone with a twisted sense of humor, or maybe something much darker and more sinister. Finishing reading the article aloud, I shook my head and murmured, "What awaits us this time? I've never dealt with zombies before. It's scary, but also intriguing." I tore my eyes away from the phone and asked Neil, "What do you think it could be?" Neil kept his eyes on the road, his face remaining impassive. "It could be anything," he replied. "From a prank to some kind of virus." These words seemed to hang in the air, penetrating my soul and making me wonder what we should be prepared for. I looked out the window and saw dense forests rushing past, their shadows seeming to reach out to the car, wanting to engulf us. We passed by small villages, each seeming frozen in time. Houses with crooked roofs, abandoned barns, fields overgrown with weeds. All this created the feeling of a dying land, abandoned and forgotten. Occasionally, lone figures walked along the roadside, their faces hidden in shadow, and their eyes full of indifference to what was happening around them. Several hours passed before we reached Whitehall. This town looked like a cutout from the past. The streets were narrow and winding, paved with old cobblestones that had long lost their former smoothness. Houses stood close together, their facades peeling from time and weather. On the main street, the only one with asphalt paving, there were small shops and cafes, their windows adorned with faded signs. We wasted no time and immediately headed to the address where the Miller family lived. The house turned out to be a large old building with a wide porch and peeling paint on the walls. The rickety shutters flapped in the wind, giving the house an even more ominous look. Tall trees surrounded the property, their branches reaching out to the house as if trying to embrace and hide it from prying eyes. We approached the front door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a middle-aged woman appeared before us. She had dark hair tied in a messy bun and deep shadows under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights. Her face was scared and tired, but hope flickered in her eyes when she saw us. "Good afternoon," I began, showing my credentials. "We're FBI agents." The woman visibly sighed with relief and invited us in. "I'm so glad you've come. Please, come in." We entered the house, feeling the old spirit of the place. We were led to the kitchen where a man sat at the table, his head bowed. This was the head of the family, John Miller, a tall and sturdy man with gray hair and kind but tired eyes. Seeing us, he lifted his head and smiled with clear relief. "Good to see you, agents," said John, rising from his seat and extending his hand. "I'm John Miller." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Miller," I replied, shaking his hand. "We're here to help figure out what happened." We sat at the table and Mrs. Miller served us tea. Taking the cup, I felt the hot drink slightly warm my tense hands. "Tell us more about what happened," Neil requested, looking at both spouses. "It was terrible," said John Miller, his voice trembling from the memories. "You understand when she came. We had just said goodbye to her, and then she appeared." He began to mutter something incoherent, his words jumbled. It was clear that he was deeply shocked by the incident. "Our children are still upstairs, not coming out of their rooms," he added, looking towards the staircase. I tried to calm him down and asked him to tell us everything in order. His wife, Susan, sat next to him and took his hand. She began to speak, trying to remain calm. "As you already know, we buried her the day before. The ceremony went off without a hitch. When she died, the coroner's report didn't reveal anything suspicious. We can't understand why this happened to her. I asked if they had noticed anything strange before her death. "Not really," Susan replied, thinking. "But when she came, in that form, she moved strangely, like a puppet. She was unusually pale, although maybe that's because she was dead, and her hair, it had turned white like an albino's. It used to be gray, but not that white, and also... She showed no signs of aggression, just sat with us at the table." John and Susan exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and confusion. "She just sat there," Susan continued, her voice trembling, "and ate her cereal as if nothing had happened." We asked them a few more questions and then requested to see the house where their grandmother had lived. However, they refused to go there. The recent incident had left a deep impression on them. After obtaining the address, we decided to go there ourselves, taking the keys from the owners who didn't mind. The grandmother lived nearby, just a few blocks away. When we arrived at her house, we were met with an old, dilapidated building with peeling paint on the walls. The windows were covered with a thick layer of dust, and the gable was adorned with intricate carvings that, despite their age, retained their eerie beauty. Tall trees stood like guardians around the house, their branches intertwining, creating shadows that amplified the sense of gloom. We approached the door and, inserting the key, cautiously opened it. Inside, the house was shrouded in semi-darkness, emanating a heavy smell of old wood and dust. In the living room stood massive antique furniture sets, covered with a layer of dust. The walls were adorned with photographs in old frames, showing faces of long-gone people. We walked down a narrow corridor that led to the kitchen. Everything was left as if time had stopped. Dishes covered with a thin layer of dust stood on the table, and old books and jars with unknown contents lined the shelves. After exploring the house, we headed to the garden. Behind the house, something strange was revealed. Gigantic plants. Enormous tomatoes and eggplants grew in the garden as if from another reality. Neil bent down to examine one of the plants. He plucked a leaf from one of them and, holding it up against the sun, started to scrutinize it. "Nothing suspicious here," he said, but his voice betrayed a slight unease. I also looked around and noticed a small plant with purple veins on its leaves. Its flowers resembled stars and were the same purple color. I had never seen such a plant before, but the world of botany is vast, and anything is possible. We took a few pictures and returned to the house. My head was full of thoughts about the giant tomatoes and where such a mutation could have come from. We would need to ask the locals. While thinking about tomatoes, I suddenly thought of pizza. "We should get something to eat," I muttered, looking around as if searching for something that could unravel all these mysteries. We didn't find anything suspicious in the house except for the giant vegetables in the garden. Deciding that we needed to learn more from the locals and find out where the grandmother's body had disappeared to, we headed back to town. Driving through Whitehall, we noticed that the streets were surprisingly empty. The silence and lack of people heightened the atmosphere of mystery and unease. Soon, however, we saw a lone figure of an old man heading somewhere. We stopped beside him, and I rolled down the window. "Excuse me, where are all the townspeople?" I asked. The old man, dressed in a checkered shirt and a straw hat, looked at us with surprise. He spat out a piece of straw and squinted before answering. "Where is everyone? How can you not know? It's harvest festival time. The whole town is gathered at the fair. This year's harvest was truly legendary. Even TV crews have come, can you believe it?" He struck his chest as if to emphasize the importance of the event. It was a big deal. The old man pointed in the direction we needed to go. "Straight down the main street, then turn left and you'll see the fair. Everyone's there." Thanking him, we headed in the indicated direction. I thought that the Harvest Festival could be an excellent opportunity to gather information. If something strange was happening in this town, the residents would surely mention it, especially in the festive atmosphere where conversations flow freely. When we arrived, we were greeted by the sight of a typical village fair. Rows of stalls were filled with a wide variety of goods, from homemade crafts to fresh vegetables and fruits. The air was filled with the scent of fresh pastries and grilled meat, and the voices of vendors hawking their wares echoed all around. As we walked past the stalls, we noticed the giant fruits and vegetables. The stall owners were indeed proud of their produce, and it was clear why. Enormous apples, gigantic pumpkins, and tomatoes. The size of children's heads attracted the attention not only of the locals but also of fair visitors. We started asking people if they had seen anything suspicious, but most replied that they hadn't noticed anything unusual. One woman from whom we bought an apple answered our question about the source of such large vegetables with a smile. "There's no secret, just a miracle this year." Neil wiped the apple with his handkerchief and took a big bite. The apple was so large that he had to make an effort to take a bite. "Really tasty," he said, smiling. We continued our inquiries until we came across a man. He was a typical resident of a remote province, wearing a checkered shirt, denim overalls, and a small cap on his head. He was sitting in a folding chair and selling huge mushrooms. We approached him and asked where he had gathered them. "Of course, in the forest," he replied, and we began asking if he had seen anything suspicious. After our words, his eyes seemed to light up, and spitting, he began to speak. "Yes, I saw something strange recently. As you know, our forest is very large, and a lot of interesting things can be found there, but most of it is fiction. What I saw recently, I really saw with my own eyes. There were albino animals. Yes, albinos sometimes occur in nature, but not in such numbers. Once, an absolutely white squirrel ran in front of me. Then I noticed a white owl, and also completely white wolves. Well, you know, that's not normal. And they had some strange behavior. They didn't seem to fear me. But what was even more unusual was that I saw strange lights." He paused for a moment, then continued. "One day I stayed out late picking mushrooms, and I was just starting to head home when I saw something strange among the trees. As I got closer, I discovered glowing yellow lights. They were swirling, but soon seemed to notice me and began drifting towards me. I was really scared then and ran as fast as I could. Since then, I haven't gone back to that place." We listened attentively, noting these curious facts. Then we asked him where exactly this place was. The man explained in detail how to get there, and we thanked him, continuing to ask questions of other fairgoers. Soon we heard a buzz around us. People began flocking to the square, where a large stage stood, decorated with flowers, and an arch with the inscription "Annual Best Farmer Contest." On the stage stood two people, an elderly man and a woman. The man took the microphone and announced, "The Annual Best Farmer Contest is now open. We have carefully examined all the contestants and their produce." After that, the man opened an envelope, pulled out a piece of paper, and solemnly announced, "The winner is Elliot Greed." As soon as he pronounced this name, a terrible woman's scream erupted from the crowd. Other voices joined in, and in an instant, panic and chaos ensued. Neil grabbed my arm, and we started climbing onto the stage. Once on top, we saw that people had scattered, but something strange was happening in one area. Finally, we saw what it was. It was a huge white bear, but not the kind that lives at the North Pole. It was a regular brown bear, but an albino. Its movements were unnatural, and its eyes glowed with emptiness. It was a zombie creature. The bear was furiously attacking people. We saw it tearing and mauling, creating chaos and horror around it. People were screaming and running, trying to escape the bloodthirsty beast. "Neil, that's it!" I shouted, pointing at the bear. "Damn right it is!" Neil replied, grabbing my arm. "We need to stop it!" It was a truly horrifying sight. Blood and human bodies were flying around, creating a terrifying chaos. The white bear, feeling nothing but animal rage, was tearing and rending. The crowd was in a panic. People were screaming and stumbling, trying to save themselves. Mothers were grabbing their children. The elderly were struggling to stay on their feet, and screams and moans of pain were everywhere. I saw someone fall, and the bear rushed towards them while nearby people were trying to crawl away in terror but couldn't move from fear. The air was filled with the smell of blood and fear, mixed with screams and growls. "Run to the car for weapons!" Neil shouted to me, realizing that we were helpless against this monster without arms. I nodded and dashed through the fair, weaving between running people and falling stalls. Navigating through the crowd, I pushed aside fallen baskets of fruits and vegetables. The path was difficult. People were rushing around me, some falling, others standing frozen in shock. Reaching the car, I flung open the door and rushed to the trunk. I pulled out the weapons we had brought for unforeseen circumstances and hurried back. Holding a heavy shotgun, I once again dashed through the fair, this time moving faster and more determinedly. When I returned, the bear was still rampaging, tearing everything in its path. Neil, breathing heavily, stood beside me and took one of the guns. Armed, we ran towards the bear. As we got closer, I started shooting. Neil joined me, and we both aimed at the creature's head, believing that zombies could only be killed by a shot to the brain. But it seemed to be a stereotype. No matter how much we shot, the bear kept moving. Its head was almost severed, but it seemed not to matter. The worst part was that the dead people were starting to come back to life. The number of zombies was growing. Shooting people, even dead ones, was becoming increasingly difficult. But Neil, without hesitation, shot an approaching zombie, blowing its head off. It kept moving as if nothing had happened. They were gradually surrounding us. I thought it was the end for us. These zombies moved surprisingly fast. Not like the slow creatures we were used to seeing in movies. These beings were quite agile. As they closed in, suddenly Neil pulled something shiny from his pocket and threw it to the ground. It flashed brightly, blinding everyone around. All the zombies froze. Neil grabbed me by the clothes and dragged me, shouting, "We need to run!" I didn't hesitate and ran after him. The people around had already scattered, leaving us alone. We reached the car, jumped in, and sped away. I noticed that Neil's shirt was covered in blood. He was injured, but he didn't show it and drove the car with a calmness that could surprise anyone. "You're hurt," I said, looking at him with concern. "It's just a scratch." He brushed it off, keeping the car on the road. "The important thing is we got out of there." We immediately called for backup and reported that the code was red. This meant that cleaners were supposed to arrive in the town. Stopping by the roadside, we started bandaging Neil's wound. The wound was shallow, but clearly from a bite. I looked at him worriedly, fearing he might turn into a zombie soon, but there were no signs of it yet. I remembered that those people turned almost immediately. Pointing this out to Neil, I asked, "Why aren't you turning?" He pondered and said, "Maybe the infection spreads differently." I began to think about how it might work. Perhaps this creature couldn't infect living people, and for a person to turn into a zombie, they had to die first. The infection could happen from a bite, or maybe people were already infected before. Then I remembered how Neil took a big bite of the apple. Could it be that the giant fruits and vegetables were infected? This meant that Neil couldn't die, though he couldn't die anyway. "What are you thinking?" Neil asked, noticing my thoughtful look. "I think the infection might be coming from those giant fruits and vegetables," I replied. "You ate an apple. If it was infected, we need to be very careful." We discussed the situation and concluded that everything started in the forest. We decided to head there to figure out what was going on. We reached the forest, feeling the tension mounting with each passing mile. The dark trees, like silent sentinels, lined the road, their canopies forming a dense green roof that let in no light. The silence of the forest seemed ominous, as if time itself had slowed down here, leaving us alone with the unknown. Stepping out of the car, we armed ourselves. Neil opened a silver briefcase and took out a device resembling a high-tech detector. Its metallic body gleamed in the dim light, filtering through the thick foliage. "This will come in handy," Neil said, looking at me. We entered the forest, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting as if watching our every move. The surrounding silence was eerie, broken only by the rustling of leaves underfoot and occasional unidentifiable sounds. Each step forward was difficult. The darkness around was impenetrable, and the light from our flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the gloom. The trees looked like grotesque figures, their gnarled branches reaching out towards us as if trying to stop us. Suddenly we heard a strange sound, like a whisper. It seemed to come from the depths of the forest, making us tense up. Neil turned on the device, and it began to emit quiet signals, indicating anomalies nearby. We continued walking, listening carefully to every sound. Passing by an old oak tree, we noticed its roots twitching, as if they were alive. We exchanged uneasy glances and continued on, trying to ignore the oddities around us. Along the way, we encountered oddly twisted trees and unusually large mushrooms, their caps glowing with a faint phosphorescent light. Suddenly, we came upon a clearing bathed in a dim, greenish light emanating from strange plants. They looked unnatural, their leaves veined with purple, and their flowers glowed like tiny stars. "Something's not right here," Neil whispered, examining the anomalous plants. We moved on, feeling fear gripping our movements. The forest seemed like an endless labyrinth filled with secrets and dangers. Suddenly, we heard a rustling in the bushes. Turning around, we saw a figure hiding in the darkness. It moved too quickly to make out. Neil raised his weapon, ready for an attack. We slowly advanced, realizing that the forest was full of unknown threats. At that moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. The forest was alive and clearly did not want us there. We continued through the forest, feeling the darkness thickening around us. Suddenly, I felt a strange, icy sensation, as if someone was watching us. Looking back, I noticed movement among the bushes. "Neil, someone is watching us," I whispered, gripping my gun tighter. We pressed on, trying to move quietly. Soon, small rodents appeared on the path ahead of us. They were albinos, their red eyes gleaming eerily in the dark. They followed us, gradually getting closer. "Look," I pointed at them. "Those are the albino animals." But that was just the beginning. Soon, birds, also albinos, appeared in the sky. Their white wings flashed among the trees, and they began to descend, aiming for us. "We need to get rid of them," Neil shouted, raising his weapon. We started shooting, aiming at the rodents and birds, but there were too many of them. With each shot, it seemed their numbers only increased. They continued to advance, filling the forest with their menacing forms. "We need to run!" I shouted, realizing our situation was becoming critical. We dashed through the forest, trying to escape the swarm of small animals and zombie birds. The rodents climbed up our legs, trying to bite, while the birds dive-bombed us from above. We fought them off as best we could, but they kept coming. "Keep going, don't stop!" Neil yelled, pushing through the dense underbrush. The whole scene felt like a nightmarish horror. The forest seemed endless and safety was far from us. We ran, stumbling and falling, but each time we got up and kept moving, knowing that stopping meant death. It felt like death itself was chasing us, embodied in these strange and sinister creatures. Our only chance was to keep running without looking back and not giving in to the terrifying threat. Neil, seeing that we couldn't outrun them, pulled out the shiny object from his pocket again and threw it to the ground. It was a paralyzer, a device capable of temporarily immobilizing living creatures. A flash of blinding light spread around, and our pursuers froze in place like statues. "We have a few minutes! Run!" Neil shouted. We bolted further, continuing to move in the direction the hunter had indicated. The forest became stranger and more frightening. We noticed more and more plants with purple veins. Each step brought us more of these unusual plants, their leaves and flowers glowing faintly. How did the locals not notice this? I wondered. Soon we reached the center of this anomaly. Before us stood an enormous purple tree, both majestic and sinister. Its trunk was massive, with deeply grooved bark that seemed almost alive. The tree's branches reached upwards like giant arms covered in glowing purple leaves and star-like flowers. The tree's roots twisted across the ground like enormous tentacles. On some of them grew the same giant vegetables and fruits we had seen at the fair. But here they seemed even more ominous and unnatural. "This is the source of everything," Neil whispered, his eyes fixed on the sinister tree. "This place is the epicenter." We stood in horror, realizing that before us was something that had changed the entire forest and caused all these strange occurrences. The purple tree seemed alive, its leaves rustling as if whispering dark secrets to each other. We began to approach the tree, trying to make no sound. The eerie silence was broken only occasionally by the rustling of leaves. I couldn't take my eyes off this gigantic purple entity, trying to understand what it could be. "Neil, what is this?" I asked, but he just shook his head, indicating he didn't know either. Suddenly we noticed that life was bustling around the tree. Small albino animals like squirrels and rats scurried back and forth. Their behavior was strange and frightening, as if they were under the control of the tree. Albino birds perched on the branches watched us with their eerie red eyes. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to destroy this monstrosity. Suddenly, Neil pointed to the suitcase. Of course, it contained powerful explosives. We needed to get closer to the tree to plant the charge. We moved cautiously, trying not to attract attention. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the tree's roots came to life and began attacking us, writhing and grabbing our legs. Zombie animals also rushed at us, their movements quick and unnatural. "Run!" Neil shouted, firing at the approaching creatures. We dashed forward, trying to get closer to the tree. The roots twisted and grabbed at us, but we fought back, trying to break through the chaos. The zombie animals surrounded us, their lifeless eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Hang on!" I yelled, trying to free myself from the roots coiled around my legs. Neil managed to break free and kept moving forward, pulling me along. We fought off the attackers, but there were more and more of them. Each step towards the tree was a tremendous effort, but we knew we had to keep going. This was our only chance. Finally, we got close enough. Neil opened the suitcase and began setting up the explosives, his hands moving quickly and confidently. I covered him, shooting at the approaching creatures, trying to keep them at bay. "Almost done!" Neil shouted, setting the last charge. The tree's roots came to life again, attacking us with renewed vigor. The zombie animals attacked from all sides, their hateful faces twisted in grimaces. "It's done! Run!" Neil yelled, and we sprinted away from the tree, trying to escape this hell. We ran without looking back, feeling the roots and creatures following us. Adrenaline was pumping in our ears, and I knew that every move could be our last. But we kept running, knowing we had to get to a safe distance before the explosion. We hadn't made it far enough when the explosion went off. A deafening roar shook the entire area, and we were thrown back by the shockwave. I was flung to the side and hit the ground, feeling the world slow down around me. My ears rang and my vision blurred for a moment. Then there was another flash, this time purple, as if a glowing dome covered the entire area. I lay on the ground trying to recover, feeling my body refusing to obey. Gradually, my hearing started to return, and I heard the muffled sounds of the forest. Neil approached me, his face dirty, but his eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside me. I tried to respond, but my throat was dry. I nodded, trying to let him know I was okay. Gradually, the ringing in my ears subsided, and I could see my surroundings more clearly. The place where the enormous purple tree had stood was now a large crater. The tree seemed to have evaporated, leaving only emptiness. The purple plants around it instantly withered, their leaves shriveled and fell off. I struggled to my feet, feeling my whole body ache from the fall. Neil helped me, and we walked towards the crater. As we got closer, we saw that the ground around was covered in ash and debris. The silence was almost deafening, as if nature itself was holding its breath after the devastating explosion. The purple flash had left its mark, and everything looked unnaturally empty. Approaching the edge of the crater, I noticed something strange among the debris and ash. It was a piece of concrete wall, broken by the explosion, with rebar sticking out. I pointed it out to Neil. "Look, there's something there," I said, feeling adrenaline surge through my veins again. We carefully climbed down, trying not to slip on the loose soil. As we got closer, I saw a narrow gap in the concrete. I started clearing the rubble with my hands, widening the passage. Neil joined me, and soon we realized that there was some kind of underground structure beneath. We turned on our flashlights and, crawling through the narrow passage, descended inside. We were met by cold, musty air, smelling of dampness and metal. The flashlight beams revealed details. Old metal doors covered in rust, peeling walls, and chipped paint. This was an abandoned underground laboratory. The tile-lined corridors stretched into the distance, disappearing into the darkness. We cautiously moved forward, shining our flashlights ahead of us. Broken signs and plaques hung on the walls, indicating different sections of the lab. We peeked into one of the rooms. Inside were old metal tables covered in a layer of dust, scattered papers, and broken equipment. Diagrams and blueprints related to some scientific experiments hung on the walls. "It looks like they conducted some sort of research here," Neil said, examining one of the plaques covered in incomprehensible symbols. We continued exploring the underground corridors. In one of the rooms, we found broken beakers and test tubes, as well as several computers covered in a thick layer of dust. In the corner stood a massive safe, its door slightly ajar. Inside, we found records and journals describing strange experiments with plants and animals. "This is no ordinary laboratory," I said, flipping through one of the journals. They were clearly conducting experiments related to mutations. In another room, we discovered a large tank filled with a strange liquid, its walls covered in purple veins similar to those we had seen on the plants outside. "It looks like this is the source of the infection," Neil whispered, staring at the tank. We looked around trying to understand how all this was connected to the anomalies and zombies. The laboratory was filled with a grim atmosphere of abandonment and mystery. We carefully examined each room in the lab. The shelves were lined with old books and journals, fragments of scientific equipment, and numerous test tubes with unknown substances. On one of the tables I noticed a journal covered in a layer of dust. On the cover, in large letters, was written, "The Eye." "Look what I found," I said to Neil, pointing at the journal. I reached out to open it, but suddenly alarms sounded throughout the laboratory. Bright lights filled the corridors and rooms. Devices began powering on one by one. Computers hummed, monitors flickered, and the sounds of ventilation and generators filled the air. "What the hell?" Neil exclaimed, looking around in confusion. We were stunned by what was happening, trying to understand what had triggered the activation of the laboratory. Suddenly, Neil shouted to me, "Come here quickly!" I rushed to him in one of the rooms. It was furnished like a typical laboratory. Metal tables cluttered with scientific equipment and papers, monitors displaying graphs and diagrams, and various flasks with liquids. In the corner of the room stood a massive safe, its door slightly ajar. On the walls were diagrams and charts depicting various stages of mutations and experiments. Behind thick glass cages, we saw a strange creature. It looked like a giant moth the size of a dog. Its wings were covered in dark, almost black patterns, emitting a faint purple glow. The creature's eyes were huge and gleamed with an ominous red light. Its body appeared unnaturally muscular, and its legs were covered in dense hair. "What is that monstrosity?" Neil whispered, not taking his eyes off the creature. I carefully examined the room and noticed several notes scattered on the tables. One of them read, "Experiment X12. The subject exhibits unusual regenerative abilities and aggressive behavior." "It's some kind of experiment," I said, scanning the notes. "They were trying to create something that got out of control." The creature in the cage started moving, flapping its wings and making a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers down my spine. We both knew that this creation was something far more dangerous than anything we had seen before. We stepped out into the corridor, still stunned by our recent discoveries and frightening findings. The laboratory was coming to life, and every step was difficult. Suddenly, a strange creature appeared before us. It looked like a typical werewolf, but was wearing a lab coat. Its appearance was truly horrifying. Tall, muscular, with hairy limbs and long, sharp claws. Its face was twisted in a beastly snarl, and its eyes gleamed yellow like a wild animal. The creature looked at us with surprise, then bared its sharp fangs and leaped at us. I only had time to raise my gun and fire, but it didn't stop it. The werewolf grabbed my shoulder, its claws digging into my flesh, and I felt sharp pain. Neil didn't waste any time. He pulled out a knife and rushed at the werewolf, delivering blows. The creature howled and released me, focusing on Neil. The werewolf was incredibly strong and fast, each of its strikes deadly, but Neil skillfully dodged, continuing to attack. Suddenly, the werewolf made a powerful leap to the corner of the room, where there was a large control panel. With incredible agility, it pressed a big red button. An alarm started throughout the building, and the system's voice announced, "Attention! Countdown activated! Evacuation in 10 minutes!" The werewolf, satisfied with its action, snarled again and quickly disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. We didn't even have time to react. "Damn it!" Neil swore, looking at the control panel and the red numbers starting to count down the evacuation time. "We need to get out of here, and fast!" I shouted, trying to overcome the pain in my shoulder. We rushed back down the corridor, trying to remember the way out. Red lights flashed around us, and the alarm sounds echoed through the entire laboratory. We knew we had little time, and every moment was precious. Desperately trying to figure out what to do next, we raced towards the exit, realizing that now not only our lives, but also the unraveling of this sinister mystery depended on whether we could get out in time. When we got outside, instinct took over and we ran. The alarm inside the laboratory indicated that something inevitable was about to happen. We ran without looking back, trying to get as far away as possible. But we hadn't reached a safe distance when an explosion occurred. I was thrown into the air and I lost consciousness. I woke up in the forest. Around me were people in gray protective suits. Cleaners. Their presence reassured me a bit. Neil was lying nearby, and I saw that he was being attended to as well. "Are you all right?" one of the cleaners asked, noticing that I was awake. "Yes, I think so," I replied, trying to understand what had happened. "Did you see the werewolf?" They shook their heads. "No, we didn't find anyone like that," one of them answered. I sighed heavily and thought that the creature had probably escaped. I wondered if we would encounter it again. And what was this organization, the Eye? I pondered these mysteries while lying on the ground and looking at the huge crater left by the explosion. Questions swirled in my head. Why did this laboratory exist? What were its creators' goals? And how were all these horrors connected to the Eye? Neil began to regain consciousness, his face scratched and looking tired. He looked at me, and I knew that we still had a lot of work ahead of us. We could only hope that the next steps would lead us to unravel the secrets left behind by this sinister laboratory. "We need to find out more about the Eye," I said, sitting up and looking at Neil. "Yes," he nodded. "But first, we need to recover from this nightmare." The cleaners continued their work, examining the blast site and collecting evidence. I knew that our work was far from over and that new trials and dangers awaited us ahead.